of May. We now come to the backbench debate on the reports of the Defence Committee and the Committee of Public Accounts on Armed Forces Readiness and Defence Equipment. Just before we start the debate, may I indicate to the House that the Chair has no power to impose a time limit on frontbench speeches. However, the Speaker has made it plain that he expects those speeches to be kept to a maximum, and it's not a minimum, of 15 minutes. So in order to assist the front benches, I'm going to put the clock on at 15 minutes. Sir Jeremy Quin.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to propose this debate, and there's only one way to start it, which is how we should start every single debate on defence, and that is with a clear-eyed appreciation of the threat to our country, our allies and our interests. Yeah. Russia, which the Integrated Review identified and its refresh reaffirmed as our greatest adversary, has mobilised a war economy, spending nearly 40% of its budget on defence and security. Such is Russia's rush to rearm that, notwithstanding all the international sanctions, the IMF has upgraded its economic forecast for the country from 1.1 to 2.6% this year, making it the fastest growing economy in Europe. Not only has it, through its renewed and devastating attack on Ukraine, shown its willingness to disregard every aspect of decency and international law, Russia's war machine is feeding an imbalance in munitions in Ukraine, which we in the West are shamefully not doing enough to counter. The reality of war is that ultimately production lines tell. Notwithstanding the UK spending £2.5 billion this year on military support, we need collectively to be doing more, and not just in supporting Ukraine, but transforming our own supply lines. We need to enhance our readiness to help deter Russia from a wider conflagration. While the threat from Russia is grave, it is not the only threat we face. In East Asia, from which our committee has just returned, China has doubled its official spending on defence to $232 billion a year, although the real figure is much, much higher. North Korea is nuclear-armed, dangerous, unpredictable, and in closer alignment than for many years with Moscow. Iran and its proxies are destabilising the Middle East, and a constant threat via the Houthis to shipping through the Red Sea, which the Royal Navy and RAF are actively engaged as we speak. Following our withdrawal from Afghanistan, the willingness of the West to front up to these challenges is being studied by the Global South, countries vulnerable to destabilisation and, worse, by our adversaries. Any sense of the West being distracted, unwilling or unable to rise to the challenge risks providing encouragement to the increasing number of autocratic states to act in contravention of international law. The sabre-rattling Venezuela over resource-rich provinces of Guyana, a Commonwealth country, being just one recent example. So, has the risk picture changed for the worse in the last few years? Clearly. Have we fully risen to that challenge? We have not. Those of us who are old enough to recall the joy of the Berlin Wall coming down will recall that we had in that decade been investing over 5% of GDP in defence, well over twice our current commitment. In 1989, there was a justifiable rationale for reductions in defence spending. But what goes down to match a decreasing threat must assuredly go back up to meet an increasing threat, and that is where we stand today. In the Defence Committee's report, we are robust, not only about the professionalism of the armed forces, but their ability to rise to any challenge. However, they are being run hot continuously, and that has a direct impact on their ability to train for, recruit and retain for, and be equipped to face the toughest challenge imaginable, a full-scale, prolonged conflict alongside our allies with a peer adversary. This is just one of many challenges which our armed forces are designed to meet. But it is the most significant, the challenge above all others that we seek to deter. I welcome the extensive engagement of our armed forces in this year's NATO exercise Steadfast Defender, but the days when this could be a routine exercise conducted by forces dedicated solely to the preparedness to face the Russian threat are long gone. Our forces' sheer range of commitments, from global engagements to domestic matters, maintain constant pressure. The impacts are simple. Recruitment and retention that is not up to the task, a hollowing out of munition stockpiles and our means to replenish them, and an inability to prepare and train for the worst-case scenario at the intensity required to bolster our allies and, with confidence, deter adversaries. Our report highlights the urgent need for change. To enable us to be fully prepared for peer-on-peer warfighting, something must give, be it the scale of operations and engagements or the size of national investment in defence. There is no doubt, in my mind, the course that needs to be taken. The global operations conducted by our armed forces have a critical supporting role in our efforts to deter and prevent expansionism by our adversaries. What the UK needs is not a diminution of our ambition, it is an increase in our investment. I am acutely aware, in saying that, of the regular charge that additional UK investment in defence is wasteful if the MOD does not get its house in order on procurement. The PAC has set out in its report the difficulties faced by the MOD in meeting its equipment plan objectives. Reports over the years, not least from the HCDC subcommittee under my right honourable friend, the member for Rayleigh and Wickford, have highlighted where the MOD needs to do better on procurement. I've no doubt we'll hear from my right honourable friend and others some of the core weaknesses these reports have revealed. I will give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm grateful, and the answer to his question is yes. But could he explain to the House that one of the things that the committee thought about very carefully was how candid we should be about the weaknesses in our armed forces, and that after much careful deliberation we did not include anything in our Ready for War report which we had reason to believe our potential adversaries did not already know?
I said we'd hear from our right honourable friend, and indeed we shall. And he's absolutely right on that point. We are incredibly careful as a committee to keep the right side of the line. There is a lot of stuff in our report, there's a lot of facts that make very, very, very unpleasant reading. Really unpleasant reading. Haven't got time to list them all today, Sir Roger, with the clock whirring through as it is. But I commend the report. It goes through in great detail some of the problems that we face. But if we don't front up to those problems, as my right honourable friend says, they will be well known to our adversaries. If we don't front up to them, we'll be fooling no one but ourselves. Yeah. I believe, though, and I obviously have a personal interest in this, that we have seen over the last 5 years from the MOD a real determination to get better, and there are structural changes that will embed improvement. The Defence and Security Industrial Strategy moved the MOD away from competition by default to viewing our defence sector as a critical strategic asset. That has proved a timely intervention, placing more emphasis on building sovereign capacity and greater reassurance of our supply chains. This has marked an improvement in the relationship with industry. Companies large and small are more engaged than they have ever been in the early thought processes around capability requirements and specifications. There is better investment in SROs to exercise control and authority over projects. When the department and industry work together, for example on Poland's defence expansion or on novel technologies for Ukraine, it is a formidable combination. Making exports and industrial cooperation into procurement at the earliest stage works for industry and works for the UK. Above all, achieving minimum deployable platforms early and allowing for spiral development, if properly invested against, will generate not only routinely upgraded state-of-the-art platforms, but industrial partners able to retain and invest in their workforce and R&D, going beyond feast and famine to long-term co-development. The Minister's recently announced reforms, I believe, are excellent. They institutionalise reforms that really will improve our procurement. But for them to work, as they deserve to, there needs to be cultural change. Uniformed SROs need to recognise the profoundly different skill set that applies to procurement. They need to be encouraged to seek commercial and legal advice early, to escalate problems. Above all, to be willing to recognise when a project won't work, take the learning and call it a day. If we are focused, as we must be, on cutting-edge solutions, some won't work. In any commercial entity, that's not a sign of failure. That is a recognition that in a portfolio, you need to take some risks that will not succeed. In DE&S, there are many good people doing a difficult and demanding job. But I do believe it is absolutely possible, as part of the current reforms, to instil and reward greater entrepreneurialism and productivity. They have the pay freedoms to do so. With cultural change and proper investment, the reforms will move us from peacetime lethargy, influenced by staccato funding, closer to the urgency and realism that the threats demand. But one thing is clear. No one on these or the opposition benches should be in any doubt that we can get to where we need to be against the current threat simply by being a bit better at procurement. As our report has made clear, there are significant improvements in everything from stockpiles to housing that are required simply to retain, maintain, and I will give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, and I'm glad he's mentioned accommodation. When I succeeded in my, I focused on this because would he agree with me that accommodation is as much as an operational capability as actual hardware in the battlefield?
I support the point made by my right honourable friend. For too long we've gone with fix and fail. That did change in recent years, and more investment is being put into our housing. But it really needs to, because we have a crisis in retention and recruitment. We're losing far more experienced personnel than we are able to recruit, something the report sets out in vivid and very scary detail. And housing is part of that offer to our brilliant defence personnel that we need to get right. So, as I say, there are significant areas that we do need to improve on, from stockpiles to housing, just to maintain at the current size our current force structure, let alone, as we should, to increase it. And while addressing all of those issues, we must also increase our fundamental defence production capability. In the 1930s, we underwrote commercial military expansion. We should be absolutely prepared to do the same. All of which makes it absolutely clear that while better buying will of course help, this is alongside, not instead of, sustained, effective and increased investment. Investment horizons on priority projects must stretch well beyond annual commitments to allow proper planning. We will make savings if the services don't gamble all their chips on the delivery of the perfect platform while it's their turn. They won't do that if they know that funding will be there for upgrades. Industry, on that basis, will invest alongside, will work with SMEs and train the workforce we need if they know that we are marching together for the long term rather than at the end of every order they may well be marched off the end of the cliff. The need for increased defence investment will be true in any circumstances when faced by the threats that we do. It is all the more vital when the degree of commitment to Europe of the United States is being questioned. This government has, since 2015, showed itself ready to make difficult decisions, show leadership on the early days of Ukraine, and increase investment. In my personal opinion, the government must now set out its timetable for reaching and sustaining 2.5%. While decisions should be taken capability up rather than numbers down, it is also my view that we are unlikely to be able to meet and deter expanding threats in the longer term for less than 3%. This would remain a low level of annual insurance compared to the relatively recent past. However, the sooner the government commits and invests, the lower the ultimate price that is likely to fall on this country. While, by doing so, we might be able to help save all Europe by our example, a failure to invest could result in a very high price indeed.
Question is, as on the order paper, Dame Meg Hillier.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I really welcome this debate. And to have a debate with 5 former Defence Ministers present and speaking, I think is almost probably a record in this place, and certainly in recent years. And I very much thank the Chair of the Defence Select Committee for laying out the global challenges that this country faces and some of the capability concerns. And I know with the expertise in the room, we'll hear more about that. So I stand as Chair of the Public Accounts Committee. Sometimes we feel a bit like the second Defence Select Committee because of the amount of time we spend examining the vast expenditure that this country lays out on defence, that taxpayers give to the government, trusting that it will be spent well, but sadly we see too often that it is not spent as well as it should be, that we see money going in, but not the capability coming out that we require. The Public Accounts Committee examines that defence spending and the delivery. Our job is to look at the economy, the efficiency and the effectiveness of taxpayers' money and how it's spent by government. And as I say, the MOD too often falls short on this. We have huge concerns as a committee, and this report is only one of our latest on the subject, about the ability of the Ministry of Defence to deliver projects on time and to budget. And just because we have war paint on ships or something is a very important and interesting and exciting technology to support our men and women on the front line, it does not mean that it shouldn't be treated like any other major project in government and managed well and managed properly. There's no point having something late but perfect if our frontline personnel need that. And we've seen, as we highlight in our report, recent global events, which I won't go into as the Chair of the Defence Committee has highlighted, that really throw into sharp focus why it is so vital that we deliver on time and that we have the capability and industrial capability to make sure that we are ramping up when, for example, munitions are used at a pace. The Public Accounts Committee has examined the equipment plan from the Ministry of Defence for now over 12 years, all the time that I've been a member of the committee and I've had the privilege of being chair for the last 9. So the Defence Equipment Plan is the 10-year programme for the capability that the Ministry of Defence says it requires. It lays out how that will be funded and where the challenges are and where the gaps in funding are. And all bar last year were deemed unaffordable, but the Public Accounts Committee took the view that even in the year where it came out as affordable from the Ministry of Defence, we felt that was on assumptions that were not realistic. We did not believe it was fully affordable. And that affordability is the gap, quite in simple terms, between what the capability is that the Defence Equipment Plan lays out and the money available. And sometimes, because it's over 10 years, there have been times, and I'm sure some of the former ministers in this room, and indeed maybe even the current minister, might come up with reasons why that is, because over 10 years it's fine, we'll juggle it a bit, we'll balance a bit, we'll get efficiency savings here and there. And really, frankly, we've seen those arguments and excuses come through far too often, and the efficiencies don't arrive, or issues and defence programmes are put off and delayed, and by delaying it, we see a reprofiling of the costs, but actually no real reduction in the costs, and we see those chickens coming home to roost. And this year, the gap between what capability is required and what's affordable is 16.9 billion, so nearly 17 billion pounds over that 10-year period. And if you add in what the Army would have delivered, so perhaps it's worth explaining that for some very odd reason, and the Public Accounts Committee has taken a very strong view on this, though happily even in the room, the Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Defence acknowledged there was an anomaly here. The commands and the MOD put in their costs for the programmes. Most of them put in the full cost of all the capability required. The Army only put in for the cost of what it could afford. So if we add in the capability that the Army actually requires, that's another 12 billion on top of that, nearly 17 billion pounds, which makes the gap even bigger. So there's been a clear deterioration in affordability. I think it's fair to say, and it is true, that of course 10 billion of that is because of inflation costs. And we know partly the reasons for that, but I'm not going to go into that here and now. And about 2 billion is to do with foreign exchange costs, which again the Public Accounts Committee examines quite regularly with the MOD and the Treasury. But even however you hedge that, there's going to be some challenge with foreign exchange because of the nature of some of our defence procurement. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Thank you for the Honourable Friend for giving way. But would you also agree with me it's been made worse by the tendency of the MOD to purchase off-the-shelf solutions from the United States in dollars, which is now accounted for a huge amount of the defence budget. And as she says, even the hedging, it is a dead weight around the defence budget.
Yeah, I think the Honourable Gentleman raises an important point, and we could almost have a whole debate about that, because I will touch on, but we don't have time to go into full detail today, the whole issue about a defence industrial strategy. And I think a lot of it comes down to that if we're buying things off the shelf, sometimes that can be more cost effective, but we need to be careful and cautious, because the longer those projects are, the more there is a risk of foreign exchange challenges, and sometimes there is a risk to our own sovereign capability and the capability and longevity of some of our defence industries. But we do recognise that with our allies we work in an international world in this. So there is no straightforward answer, but I do think it is an area that not just the Ministry of Defence, but the whole of government should be looking at in terms of defence industrial strategy, because I think it is actually vital. And just to segue for a moment, both the Chancellor and Shadow Chancellor talk about growing the economy, and where our defence industries are based are in areas where if you could up the skills and jobs available, that could have a major boost to the economy. So there are a lot of opportunities there. But the Ministry of Defence has not credibly demonstrated how it will manage its funding to deliver the military capabilities the government wants. Our latest report says that the government needs to get a firmer control of defence procurement because of this very large deficit and the capability requirements that are needed. The budget, though, has increased, because I'm sure the Minister will stand up and tell us how much extra money is going into defence. But it's not just about the money, it's about how it's managed, of course. And the budget has increased by £46.3 billion over the next 10-year period, compared just to last year's equipment plan. And the PAC has warned, though, like I said, that the deficit is even bigger than expected, so that extra budget is going to be taken up by the deficit if it's not managed down. And part of the reason, as I say, is inflation. Another major impact is the costs of the Defence Nuclear Organisation, of course responsible for the vital nuclear deterrent, and that's increased by £38.2 billion since last year's plan. And one of our other concerns as a committee is that the MOD has been putting off making major decisions about cancelling or reprofiling programmes. Reprofiling is not something that's always a good thing, but sometimes we have to trim according to what's necessary. If it can't afford it, it should make a really hard decision, but it's optimistically assumed that the plan would be affordable if the government fulfilled its long-term aspiration to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence each year, despite there being no guarantee that that will happen, and of course in an election year, no guarantee of even which party will be in government to consider that. And we know, and the Defence Select Committee will know even more than the Public Accounts Committee, how much the MOD is increasingly reliant on the UK's allies to protect our national interests. And that means that we also have to play our part and make sure we're delivering this. Too often, well, for all the time I've been on the Public Accounts Committee, that's 13 years this year, the Ministry of Defence has been led by optimism bias. And it's now pressing on, not just with optimism, but on the sniff of optimism. There's so little left in that approach that will actually deliver. We must call this out and call a spade a spade. It can only deliver what is affordable. So either the money goes in or they trim what they're trying to do, because this approach of trying to do everything all at once and not be able to afford it is just not going to work. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Most grateful, Honourable Lady. I'm listening carefully, and I've not cast eyes on the report she's speaking about. But I wonder what investigation made talks about governments or the MOD trimming projects. The lessons of George Osborne slashing the Type 45s in half have had a huge impact on naval capability, and of course there's over 530 Ajax tanks to come. I'm asking what her opinion is on when we look and say make savings. Actually, it's a false economy. In the long run, it's far better to increase the GDP spend than slash projects and totally undermine how the defence programme was originally laid out.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm tempted by the Honourable to go into all sorts of long discussion about how the Public Accounts Committee looks at these issues. Certainly resetting projects and programmes can be very problematic. Sometimes stopping something partway through can be very expensive, but equally altering the requirements partway through can add on costs. And one of the problems here when I talk to commands or the centre is that sometimes people want to gold plate what they're procuring. And sometimes we need to look at doing those things in a different way. But brutally, at the current situation, it's not affordable. So it does mean making hard decisions about whether something is actually stopped or no longer procured, or whether more money is made available. And if more money is made available, as I've said, and the Public Accounts Committee repeats ad infinitum, then we need better project management on this. And the other thing that the Ministry of Defence is saying very clearly is it won't make any decisions until the next spending review. I think everybody in this chamber today knows that is supposed to be November, but of course with the general election looming, it usually takes from the first budget of a new government 6 months before the next spending review. So we could be floating on the fumes of the current spending settlement until about summer of next year. And that means we're still pouring good money after bad in certain cases in the Ministry of Defence. They've really got to tighten it and cannot live on hope alone. And I touched on industry in answer to my right honourable friend, and industry needs a consistent and certain supply chain, certain supply of business to keep its supply chain going, for both resilience, but to ensure that industry properly invests in the infrastructure necessary. And we've seen some of our private sector industries leaving equipment and buildings and so on to crumble because they haven't had that continuity of supply. Some of the blame is on them too. It's not just, we can't just say it's the Ministry of Defence, but that consistency of supply is really vitally important. And as I've said, if we could get that right, there's a real potential boon to the economy as well. We look, of course, a lot at procurement, and we have been saying for the last decade or more that senior responsible owners need to be far longer in place, but need to be there for that right period of time where their expertise is needed and then moved on for the next phase of the project. And we need to reward people who stay in those jobs, not expect civil servants to roll over, or indeed military attachés to roll over on a 3-year basis and just think they just have to keep things ticking on. They need proper ownership and proper reward for when they get things right. The MOD is beginning to move in the right direction on senior responsible owners' skills and longevity, but it's still got a lot of work to do to catch up to where it needs to be. And the funding timeframes I've touched on, but I think that the Treasury also needs to seriously consider properly controlled longer-term budgets, as it's beginning to do in certain areas of the Defence Equipment Plan. It doesn't mean a carte blanche to the MOD. It needs to be very tightly controlled. I'm very clear about that, and the Public Accounts Committee is, but it is very vital that takes place. And finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, there is a concern on the Public Accounts Committee that though we have access to many areas of government and all areas of spending if we choose to look at it, and we as a committee, and I pay tribute to my fellow committee members who have never leaked a single bit of information of whatever sensitivity in the last 9 years, but we look at certain issues through opaque glass. And I think it is now time we had full transparency. But the mechanisms of open public committees, much as I want as much as possible to be in the public domain, is not always appropriate for certain sensitive areas that we are talking about, including, of course, in defence. So the Public Accounts Committee recommended in our latest report that there needs to be a new mechanism, a new approach that allows Parliament to properly examine in the right and secure context, or not along the lines of the Intelligence and Security Committee, but certainly not in that area, and certainly not exactly the way they do it, because sometimes we need to be more fleet of foot on certain day-to-day spending issues. And it's time we had that, so that the British public, the taxpayer, knew that every tax pound they're spending, whether it be on defence or sensitive matters in other departments, was being seen and scrutinised by senior parliamentarians who knew what they were doing and could do that on their behalf. It's an early thought of ours, but it's something that I think is important to raise, because we need that full transparency so that those officials and ministers who are spending taxpayers' money in this area of vast expense are properly scrutinised on their work.
Order. Order. Although there aren't that many members present in the chamber today, it's clear to me immediately that there's a very considerable amount of defence expertise present. And that means that we are likely to have a well-informed debate, which isn't always the case. But that being so, I'm going to impose now a 13-minute time limit on speeches. That should enable all members to have their say fairly and to allow time for a full and proper response from the front benches. Well, I hope that will satisfy all members. This is going to be a formal time limit, which means, of course, that the usual injury rules will apply. If members take interventions, time will be added. Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. May I begin by saying to the Procurement Minister on the front bench, for whom I have great regard and who is trying to reform our broken procurement system, that everything I'm about to say in the next few minutes is not personally aimed at him. To quote The Godfather, this is nothing personal, it is purely business. At his speech at Lancaster House on the 15th of January, the new Defence Secretary now famously said we are moving from a post-war to a pre-war world. His words clearly resonated both nationally and internationally. As just one example, when I was on a visit to Washington recently, these words were played back to us by Pentagon officials. Shortly thereafter, in an unclassified letter to all Conservative MPs, the Defence Secretary stressed the need for industrial improvements to rearm, in terms clearly reminiscent of the 1930s. However, let us consider what that actually means. The head of the MOD, a senior cabinet minister, has said, in effect, that we are now likely to go to war. Although he didn't specifically state who with, be it Russia, China, Iran, or someone else, that one statement, which I fear may turn out to be true if we do not rapidly improve our conventional deterrence, has incredibly serious implications for our entire defence and security posture. To begin with, the much-vaunted integrated review has now clearly been completely overtaken by events. In a world with increasing Iranian-inspired violence in the Middle East, sulphurous threats over Taiwan emanating from Beijing, and now the state-sponsored murder of Alexei Navalny, even the most naive liberal would surely have to concede that Shaps might just be right. The integrated review and its 2023 refresh is completely lacking in any great sense of urgency in reply. Similarly, the MOD Defence Command paper, which was meant to dovetail into the integrated review, also lacked a sense of urgency, even to the point of retiring a number of key frontline systems, such as radar planes and tactical transport aircraft, in favour of new equipment arriving much later in the decade. Many analysts expected this to change post-Ukraine, but no major equipment decisions were altered, even despite Putin's barbaric invasion in February 2022, something which, just from one moment, something which, incidentally, some members of us on the Defence Committee effectively predicted in a debate in this House some 6 weeks before the invasion began. I give way to the Chairman of the PAC.
I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman, who of course is the unique position of being on both the Public Accounts and Defence Select Committees, and welcome as a member of the committee. Does he share my view? This is a bit like Groundhog Day when we hear the words defence and review in whichever order. We've had how many in the last few years, and yet we never see the step change necessary to make sure that we're actually going to deliver the capability our country needs.
My Chairman on the PAC is entirely right, although in the MOD context, if it is Groundhog Day, groundhog sounds like a vehicle which has slipped to the right. More recently, after a detailed inquiry, the House of Commons Defence Committee, on which I also serve, published a damning report on the 4th of February 2024 entitled simply Ready for War? I've served on the committee since 2017, and this is one of the punchiest reports we've ever produced. In answer to the question in the title, the all-party committee, which includes 6 former MOD ministers, concluded, and I quote, "Despite the United Kingdom spending approximately £50 billion a year on defence, plus more for Ukraine, the UK's armed forces require sustained ongoing investment to be able to fight a sustained high-intensity war alongside our allies against a peer adversary. In plainer English, and as the subsequent detail in the report starkly points out, despite this very considerable outlay of taxpayers' cash, we could not fight a sustained war with Putin's Russia for more than a couple of months before we ran out of ammunition and fighting equipment, not least as we have very few tanks, ships or combat aircraft in reserve." For those who wish to read the full report, it can be found online. Given that it takes years to build a modern warship, a totally ridiculous 11 years in the case of the new Type 26 frigate, and 4 years to build a Typhoon fighter, if we had to fight what the strategists sometimes describe as a come-as-you-are war, i.e. one with little further warning, we would have to rely on whatever equipment we have to hand or could rapidly remobilise, and we simply don't have enough warning kit to win as it is, as the Public Accounts Committee's report on the equipment plan illustrates starkly. The difference and it's a 10-year plan, the difference between what the MOD aspires to buy and the funding it's likely to have available is £17 billion. But it's worse because some of the three services account for this on a different basis. So without going into all the technicalities, if you do an apples and apples comparison across the three, the gap is £29 billion. But even beyond gaps in capability of our kit, our greatest weakness is now the lack of skilled personnel to operate and maintain the equipment which we do have. Without them, and far too many of them are leaving, as the chairman of the Defence Committee said, even multi-billion-dollar aircraft systems simply remain in the hangar. One perfect example of how dysfunctional the MOD has now become regarding people is the saga of Capita, or forgive me, sir, Crapita, as they're now affectionately known to the Defence Committee. They have totally messed up the recruitment system for the British Army. A few years ago, their share price topped £4. It's now today barely 13 pence. Everyone in defence knows the outsourced contract has been a disaster, yet absolutely no one in the upper echelons of the department has the moral courage to sack them. The Defence Secretary himself recently described the situation in the Times as ludicrous. He's absolutely right in that. Indeed, no doubt he has made a note of it, of his own comments on his own famous spreadsheet. But still, nothing actually happens. So, Capita limps on as the army bleeds out. Within some parts of the army, 3 soldiers now leaving for every one Capita somehow painfully manages to recruit. If we think we are going to deter the likes of Vladimir Putin in this manner, we are living on a different planet, in a parallel universe, in a fantasy dimension. The British tax-paying public are quite entitled to ask why, given that we now spend the thick end of £50 billion a year on defence, does so little of our defence capability actually work properly? Why are some of the Army's fighting vehicles 60 years old? Why do we have hardly any battle tanks that actually work? Why do we have hardly any submarines which now regularly put to sea? Why do we have aircraft carriers which perennially break down whenever they try to leave port? Bluntly, it's because we now have a Ministry of Defence which has become, in recent years, a gigantic, sclerotic bureaucracy, constantly hidebound by needless self-generated red tape, obsessed with process rather than outcomes, in which some senior civil servants are now more interested in wokery than weaponry, endlessly ripped off by some of its own major contractors, such as Boeing to name but one, and in which key elements of our fighting equipment are so old, and the procurement system replacing them so broken, we now cannot fight a major war with Russia for more than a few weeks, as they well know. Moreover, as the Red Budget Book clearly shows in tables 2.1 and 2.2, we are cutting the core UK defence budget next year by £2.5 billion and playing smoke and mirrors with the donations to Ukraine and to addressing an overspend in the nuclear enterprise from the Treasury Reserve in order to pretend otherwise. This act of what the Russians call maskirovka, or strategic deception, is, frankly, wholly unworthy of a Conservative government. Yeah. If you happen to believe, as I do, that the role of our armed forces is determinedly to save lives by convincing any potential aggressor that were they to attack us, we would defeat them, then we are palpably failing. This is not an intellectual parlour game. This is ultimately about whether our grandchildren are going to grow up in someone else's re-education camp. But you might not know that if you walked into the current MOD. You can try and blame the military, for instance, for so frequently over-specifying new military equipment, like Ajax, that it enters service many years late. But in the end, the responsibility lies with the politicians who, theoretically at least, are supposed to be in charge. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Romans had a famous saying about military matters: civis pacem para bellum. He who desires peace should prepare for war. Given that the Secretary of State, the man who runs the department, has told us we are in a pre-war world, then surely we had better start preparing for it if we're going to have any chance whatsoever of preventing it. And we should now do that in earnest before it's too late. Very quickly.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and I know he's coming towards the end. Would he just care to remark on a couple of slightly more optimistic features of deterrence? Because deterrence of conventional forces depends on far more than an equal balance of equipment, even though, as he says, we are nowhere near achieving that. It also depends upon our allies and others who will fight in the same cause. And does he not accept that it is not just enough to take our defence spending up to 3% or more, such as the 5% we regularly spent through the Cold War, but it is also essential to ensure that our American allies remain totally involved in the deterrence process, and that the Ukrainians succeed in fending off Russia, because if they succeed, then we can contain Russia in the future as we successfully did in the past.
I agree with every word my right honourable friend, the former eminent chairman of the Defence Committee, just said. My one caveat is the MOD's excuse for these capability gaps is that we can rely on allies to fight with us. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, they'll be relying on us. And if we're not able to support them, and they are in wartime task elsewhere, things might well go horribly wrong. Yeah. Mr Deputy Speaker, I say all of this, not just as someone who served proudly as a TA infantry officer in my local Royal Anglian Regiment during the Cold War, not just as someone who is still very proud to carry the late Queen's commission, not just as a former veterans and then Armed Forces Minister in the Ministry of Defence, albeit almost a decade ago, but most of all, as I said at Prime Minister's Questions last week, as the devoted son of a D-Day veteran. Stoker First Class Regiment Francois, who died when I was 14 years of age. He told me one night of the carnage, his word, that he witnessed that day, albeit from offshore, on a minesweeper named HMS Bresse. In the afternoon, they were opposite Omaha Beach. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in Shakespeare's famous phrase, this story shall the good man tell his son. My father was a good man. And the story he told me was of a country that eventually, reluctantly, had to go to war against the evil of Nazi tyranny because, for years, its politicians had been so parsimonious, he actually said tight, and so naive that when Nazism emerged, we completely failed to deter it. That is the lesson of the 1930s, but it was also his lesson to me. He made me take a solemn vow that as his son, I would never take living in a free country for granted. Because he told me too many good men had died to achieve it. 2 years after we had that conversation, he was dead. That's why I'm here this afternoon. That is why I came into politics in the first place. As a wartime serviceman, my father was a great admirer of Winston Churchill, our greatest ever Prime Minister, who led this country through a war of national survival and then lost a general election for his trouble. When I walked into the chamber earlier this afternoon, you can still see the bomb damage caused when the chamber was bombed in 1941, and Churchill insisted that that not be repaired, lest we forget. And he was right. So in summary, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I may not be my father's contemporary, that famously courageous MP Leo Amery, so I cannot claim to speak for England on this matter. But I was elected to speak for the people of Rayleigh and Wickford. And so on their behalf, I issue this stark warning today. The skies are darkening. Brutal dictators with powerful weapons at their disposal are on the rise. The democracies are on the back foot rather than the front. History tells us again and again, indeed ad nauseum, that the appeasement of dictators, be they called Adolf Hitler or Vladimir Putin, does not work. We should be increasing the defence budget to at least 3% of GDP, what my friend used to call at least 3 to keep us free. Not cutting it as we now are and pretending that we're not. The first duty of government, above all others, is the defence of the realm. And we forget that, sir, at our peril. Civis pacem. Parabellum.
Yeah.
John Spellar.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Speaker. And there are a wide range of issues encompassed by this debate, and my right honourable colleague on the Defence Committee from Rayleigh has just outlined some of them. I want to particularly focus on one aspect, and that's industrial capacity. And by that, I don't just mean the big manufacturing plants that are well known, and the well known prime companies that very often we hear from in the national media, rightly so, but also their extended supply chains and their material suppliers, and equally and often unremarked, their workforce, and not just the engineers and craftsmen, but the crucial production workers who are vital for ramping up production, for the ability to surge in the case of a crisis. And we've seen the difficulties with that we're experiencing in response to Ukraine. Furthermore, many in that supply chain also sell to civilian market as well, including the public sector. Many of those specialist engineering companies in the Midlands supply Formula One, civil aviation, premium vehicles, as well as defence. But they need orders from defence and orders also from public sector bodies. That's in order to maintain their workload, to maintain employment, and also to be able to train the workforce of the future. And that is why, and this will be a theme throughout my contribution, a whole-of-government approach is necessary. But underlying this, of course, is the question of whether we are in a new environment or just an oscillation. Basically, is there a war going on? People of Ukraine certainly know that. The Baltic nations and Poland and Finland and Sweden know that. It doesn't mean that war is inevitable, but it certainly means that it is now possible. And failure to respond will actually make it more likely. One does have to question whether the commentariat and the British establishment actually understand that. Government needs, therefore, to make clear their view on this situation as to the state of international relations. Do they regard the invasion of Ukraine by Russia as an interlude, a very bloody one, after which the situation will return to something more nearly approximating to normal? Won't go back to status quo, but how normal will it be? Or has there in fact been a tectonic shift? And are we at best back in the Cold War, but even actually with a hot war going on in Ukraine? And the danger of extension elsewhere along the new Iron Curtain that is descending over Europe. It is quite clear that not just the politicians and the defence establishment, but the publics in Sweden and Finland clearly understand that, with a dramatic shift of opinion from centuries of neutrality as to making the historic decision to join NATO and to become very active participants. But even so, across NATO, there is not that sense of urgency and clear realisation of the crisis. Only this week, the boss of the Scandinavian ammunition company, Nammo, was in the press, pointing out that societies were still in a peacetime mode. As an example, he gave that their factory in Norway, in order to expand, needs additional electricity supply capacity. However, there is a new site for TikTok that has been created nearby. They can't get enough electricity. He did rightly point out that he thought that defence of Western Europe was slightly more important than cat videos on TikTok. And he went on to contrast that, frankly, with the Defence Production Act in the United States, which was the Truman-era response to the Korean War and based on the FDR War Powers Act, gives extensive powers to the government there, and they are using those powers. That's why they're responding to the weaknesses in procurement, ramping up production capacity, including several government-owned, government-constructed, company-operated plants. And I would ask the Minister to, in his response, to indicate whether our government is looking at this as a possible mechanism as well. And so I would also ask whether they recognise the fragility of the supply situation here as well. Because recent crises, COVID, the Red Sea, Ukraine, have already shown how vulnerable our supply chains are, and many firms and customers are finding that the so-called cheapest option can end up actually being very expensive. And let's be clear, and to be fair, this doesn't just apply to the United Kingdom. All around the world, companies are finding that extended supply lines and single points of failure at home or abroad can have very damaging consequences. The discussion has shifted, and now there is much talk about reshoring, about nearshoring and friendshoring. I'm not sure how much of this has actually penetrated into the calcified mindset of our Treasury and the senior civil service. But I hope the Minister will be able to shed some light in that regard. We must also be aware of it isn't just a Eurocentric issue, we must also be aware of the increasing tension in the Gulf, particularly arising from the destabilising impact of Iran and its proxies across the Middle East and North Africa. And also the changing posture of China, the increasingly aggressive attitude of China, which is deepening relations through AUKUS and with Japan is so necessary and welcome. And I hope the Minister can report on the success this week at the OCMEN and AUKUS conferences that are taking place in Australia, and we fully understand why the Secretary is there today rather than in this debate. But we've also got to be clear that these problems did not come out of a clear blue sky. They were shown some years ago. The Right Honourable Member for Rayleigh identified the evidence we had from an American general, that when they conducted an exercise with the British Army about an outbreak of conflict in Europe, basically we ran out of munitions in about 10 days. But nothing was done about it then. And even once the conflict had started in February of 2022 in Ukraine, and it was soon clear that artillery would play a major role in the conflict, and yet the MOD didn't place an order for new shells until July of 2023. Minister can't complain, I haven't given him notice of this. I've raised this several times in previous debates. Never had a satisfactory answer as to that period of delay. We cannot afford that degree of indecision going forward. And it's quite obvious that clearly it's not even as though we haven't had shells crisis before. We had one in 1915 brought down a government. There doesn't seem to be much of a collective institutional memory, I'm afraid, in the civil service today.
Just briefly, on that point, we're now giving £2.5 billion in the next financial year to Ukraine, and it's money well spent. but you can't spend the same pound twice. So does he agree with me that if we give that money to Ukraine, rightfully, we can't then spend it on army salaries or British shells or submarine maintenance? In other words, it's for the Ukrainians, it's not part of the UK defence budget, is it?
Well, unfortunately, it is scored in the UK defence budget, and in the claim that somehow we're keeping up defence expenditure and masking an actual cut in defence in British domestic defence spending. It is absolutely right, and I think we should be supplying more to Ukraine, and we should be enabling them. They're on the front line, they're carrying the fight, and we should be backing them, particularly, not just us, but the rest of Europe and the United States and the free world as well, should be backing them up with material. And trying to slip that into the defence budget, basically instead of part of our national commitment, I absolutely agree with him, is the wrong way of handling it. But even with the new production, I'm still not clear, the Minister may be able to clarify the matter for me, what is happening with increasing capacity for propellants and explosives. Because across the Western world, there's very few points, just 2 or 3 factories, that are capable of making these. They are stretched to capacity. I understand that difficulty. What I want to know is what's being done about creating new capacity. I know the United States is doing it. What are we doing both here and in Europe? And in that context, if I could commend the article from Ian Martin in the, I think it was in the Daily Telegraph, saying that whatever our differences over the EU and Brexit with other European countries, we should be certainly working much more closely on maintaining and creating new defence capacity, not just in terms of the military, but very much in terms of industrial capacity as well. But I will come towards the conclusion to say that while I said that the government, and indeed this House, has to take the lead, others must. The City of London and the finance houses have to accept their responsibilities as well. They have to make clear that investment in defence is not only a good investment in leading part of British manufacturing, but is actually their patriotic duty and part of the defence of the free world. But in order to get that message across and to change the mindset, that needs a whole of government approach, not just the Ministry of Defence and those of us interested in the subject here. I would also say to unions who have tens of thousands of members, and I've said this in the evidence session with the unions, in tens of thousands of members in the defence and aerospace sector, they should not stand idly by while mobs try and shut down their workplaces. Only this week, we had demonstrations outside GE in Cheltenham, which for over a century has been the Smiths factory there. And also Leonardo in Edinburgh, which I presume is the old Ferranti site. I would hope the unions will be backing their members' employment, but also the national interest, and look at any funding for bodies organising to shut these places. I fully acknowledge the issues facing our uniformed forces, their expertise and commitment, and I'm pleased that others will be highlighting their contribution and regret the government have taken their commitment for granted. But in any conflict, supply and resupply are crucial. Conflicts are not just won on the battlefield, but very much, even sometimes more so, in the factories of ourselves and our allies. That's why we need a rethink, a reset and recovery of lost ground. Will the government take up that challenge?
Yeah. It's normal.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We face a world of unparalleled complexity and threat in our recent modern experience. And this is a world where if you scan from across Europe, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, there are threats emerging and threats already in place and recognised to which we as a nation with our allies must attend and deal. And we do so in an environment where the most powerful, or almost the most powerful of the many mechanisms that affect our lives is working every day. That is the effect of technology and changes in price. And the effect of those is to bring forward new ways of making war that might have been unimaginable 2 years ago. They have the effect of bringing new actors, private actors, not merely states, into the picture who might have been unimaginable just a few years ago. And so we see evolution rapidly occurring in the nature of the threat that we must deal with. Now, this report that the Select Committee, which I was very proud to join earlier this year, has produced, is, in my view, not just an exemplary piece of work, but testimony to the quality of a committee which, and I speak as someone who was on the Treasury Committee, no slouch when it comes to quality and expertise, for 5 years, and then chair of a Select Committee myself, I have been deeply impressed by the quality of the thought and the experience and the attention that my colleagues and their clerks have brought to these matters. And this report is a very good example of that. It brings out, crucially, some of the foundational assumptions that have not yet been adequately tested in our defence thinking. Not just our operational readiness, this being a report above all about our readiness, not just our warfighting readiness, but our strategic readiness, our capacity to think ahead of that escalating, multiplying, developing threat as to where it might be in future and how we can, in a full spirit of resilience, prepare for that. And so I congratulate the work that has been done on the committee hitherto, and I've been proud to be associated with it, as I have with the previous contributions to this excellent debate. Now, we know, because there's ample historical evidence, that democracies can fight wars with an intensity and an endurance that is not available to autocracies. But historically, it has taken democratic states time to get moving, time to move public opinion, time to bring the people that are the demos with the politicians, with government, in order to bring those full resources of a nation to bear. In the modern world, we may not have time to do that. We must start to prepare now, and not just prepare as a war-fighting capability. And it's been rightly said and highlighted today that we are moving from a post-war to a pre-war world, not just in that sense, but also in bringing the need for resolution and resilience to the attention and giving it the public profile we need with people across this country. Now, it's not the first time that these matters have occurred. The House will well know. In the 18th century, a time when this country was more or less continuously at war with relatively small intervals, there was also a period where tremendous concern was given to the effects of commercial society, of peace. The worry that, as it was put in those terms, luxury and softness might yield to a loss of martial virtue. We must be aware of that problem. We see it everywhere. I myself was in Eastern Europe before 1989. I have experienced what it is like to live under a communist country and what it is like to live in the shadow of Russia. And I can tell you, it is nothing that anyone in this House should feel the tiniest appetite to even glimpse, let alone endure, let alone invite our citizens to contemplate, or indeed our allies. So we must be absolutely resolute in thinking about how that gradual process, without loss of democratic values, without the loss of our constraints, can be brought forward to ready our people for the kinds of strategic decisions that in due course, and everyone in this House will know, we pray it will never happen, but to prepare ourselves for the possibility that there could be some development for which we are so far as yet inadequately prepared. And we must address that. We must address it as a matter of money, organisation, and, of course, talent. We must fill that strategic gap in our thinking, a gap which is only being accelerated by the rapid growth in artificial intelligence, a technology which threatens to upend not just many of the many of the resources, many of the systems that we're using in this country, but much of the strategic thinking we are bringing to the whole question of what it is to be at war. And if you doubt that, look at some of the work that is being done. We've heard of Maskarovka, very rightly from my colleague, right on from Rayleigh, the use of AI in mimicry, in spoofing, in false flag operations is just something we as a country are beginning to get our head around, even, as it were, at an advanced defence and security level. So we have an escalating series of security challenges. Now, the solution to that is not more state as such. It's a much more intelligent deployment of the relationship between states and markets, between the public and the private, between the secret, the grey, and the not-so-secret. Because we've got to bring all those resources with us if we're going to be successful. And we've got to be more emphatic about the desperate need for competence. And that means competence not just in our civil servants and in our military capability and, of course, in the agencies that work alongside them. It's also competence in this House. It's also competence in this House. Our political parties have a responsibility to develop, to recruit, to enable, to understand, to enfranchise and to promote talent. And I put it to this House that no political party is doing this adequately at the moment. Myself, I think we should have chief talent officers in political parties. I think we should have people actively thinking where we can find competence, where we can find capability, where we can find knowledge, where we can find experience, and how we can deploy it into this great chamber in which we have the honour to sit. The deep issue here, if I may say so, is not just that we have a civil service, as my right honourable friend mentioned, that is preoccupied with process in a way that is understandable in peace, but I'm afraid inadequate to the preparation of war. It is not just that there is a preoccupation of process over outcome, when outcome is the only thing that matters when you're trying to deliver a capability. It is that we as a nation have not yet made that intellectual, moral, emotional, spiritual shift in deeply preparing for a pre-war situation. And we see that. The government has done a splendid, if I may say, make a party political point for a second, a splendid job in starting to take control of a very difficult fiscal situation inherited and built up through crisis over the last few years. But for what purpose? For what end? I tell you, we have come here, and the point has been made already, we do not come here, as was said famously by a man nearly, 250 years ago in Bristol. We do not come here as a congress of ambassadors. We come here as an assembly of representatives with the interest of one nation collectively to be deliberated. And that means that interest cannot be sectionalised. And it cannot be sectionalised within government. And I say this as a former financial secretary and my chairman as a former financial secretary. We do not say that this budget for defence should go up because we in any sense want to be profligate, want to have anything less than a proper constraint, a proper scrutiny of the long-term spending of this country. But it must go up. It must be shared across both parties. It must be something that even the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer should bear in their mind, should account for as if they were preparing for war in this chamber, so that we can all know that they have come to terms in their minds with the compromises, the difficulties, and the challenges that we all face today.
Kevan Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I begin by joining the Chair of the Defence Committee, the Right Honourable for Horsham, in thanking, and we should never forget, the dedication of our members, men and women of our armed forces. It's often said that the first duty of government is to keep the nation safe and protect its citizens, but we've got a Conservative Party who have admitted that they've hollowed out defence. We've had a return to war in Europe, and there are growing threats that have already been explained around the world. We now need that clear eyed vision of what we need to do in defence. It's about deterrence. There's been a lot of talk about war fighting, but the success of defence is if we deter that action from happening. But I think we do need to recognise of how we've got to where we have got to today. I hear all the calls on the benches opposite for increases in defence expenditure. I don't question those individuals' commitment or dedication, because I know many of them are very committed individuals who believe in defence as I do. But I do find it a little ironic that we've got a situation whereby between 2010 and 2016, the defence budget of this country was cut by 18%. Even with the increase, it's still 7% lower than it was in 2010. We also have a situation whereby the budget on the March the 6th was a cut in the defence budget. So I hear all the siren cries for increasing defence budget, but that's... and did we get there by accident? No, we didn't. In 2010, we had a Conservative-led coalition who tried to scare the public into saying that they inherited a £36 billion black hole in the defence budget. Well, that was absolute nonsense. Where it came from was an AA report in 2009, which said on the equipment budget that if there was a £6 billion black hole in the defence budget, and if you had flat cash for the next 10 years, it would be 30 billion. Well, the spin doctors had another 6 billion onto it, and that became the myth that was reiterated. But that then masked what they were really up to, which was slashing the defence budget in that period. And we're still looking at the consequences of those decisions. And the right member for Rayleigh and Wickford, who I do respect, talks about the 1930s moment. Well, we are in the 1930s moment. I agree with him. And the similarities are the same. In the 1920s and 30s, the Conservative government then, including Winston Churchill, who admitted it in later life, that as Chancellor of the Exchequer, he cut defence expenditure. So there are parallels there, but not the ones that I think he is referring to.
Would my right honourable friend give one?
Yes, certainly.
Thank my right honourable friend for giving way. And wasn't another key feature of that era the Treasury 10-year rule of basing defence expenditure on the assumption that there would not be a war in Europe within the next 10 years, which rather unravelled at the end of the 1930s?
Well, it did, and but the common thing is, and if you look back, I've got to say it's a matter of fact whether people like it or not, you have defence cuts under Conservative governments, and when Labour is in power, we maintain them or increase them. And if you...
Francois.
I hope this doesn't come across as nitpicking. It's important. The 10-year rule, which was a rolling 10 years, wasn't just a Treasury policy, it was the policy of the entire government, including, it wasn't rescinded by the incoming Labour government in the 20s, it was the policy of the whole government, and it was only rescinded in the mid-1930s, a few years after Adolf Hitler had already become Chancellor of Germany. It's important to get that right.
On the record, I'm not going to get into a history lesson in terms of the 10-year rule, but I think the history books that help. But what happened from 2010 onwards is what we've seen. We've had a cut of 40,000 personnel in our armed forces. And it's not just about numbers, it's about experience. We had individuals made compulsory redundant. When I was Defence Minister, if I'd have actually made people compulsory redundant, the Sun and the right-wing press in this country would have been shouting from the rooftops. What did they do? Absolutely nothing. And we lost experience. 1 in 5 of our ships was removed. 200 aircraft were removed. And the satisfaction ratings amongst our armed forces personnel is now below 50%. We have a system over the last few years which has wasted money. We've chronicled in our report. And we actually have got the £30 billion black hole in our equipment budget now that was predicted in 2009, which the chair of the Select Committee has just the PAC just referred to. So is it about whether it's 2%, 3%, 5%? No, it's not. It's actually about looking at how we've got into this situation, how we change it, and how we face the challenges that face us today. So whichever government is elected after the next election is going to have to face that. But we've got to get away from the British exceptionalism, that we are going to have a situation whereby we've got great ambitions to be global powers, like some imperial power. Well, I'm sorry, we're not. And unless you're going to actually link the resource to the ambition, you can continue this myth infinitum, but it is not going to work. So the nonsense slogan which we've had from the last few years of global Britain, though somehow we're now a pre-imperialist view where we're going around the world, well, I'm sorry, is absolute nonsense. We've got to look at what we can do to protect our own defence. And the idea that we're going to have a major power, a major play in anything that happens in the Southeast China Sea is absolute nonsense. The idea we've got 2 OPVs based in Singapore, that is going to deter the Chinese. And if anything happens there, frankly, any commitment that we can give is like a gnat on the backside of an elephant compared to what the Americans would be able to do. And we've got to be realistic about that. So what do we need to do? Well, what we need to do is look at what we need to deliver in terms of our NATO commitments. And we need also to get away from the myth, and it is a myth in our army in particular, that we're going to deliver a divisional strength to any NATO commitment. We can't do it now. We've never been able to do it for quite a few years, and we just need to be realistic about it. So what do we need to do? We need to sit down with NATO. We need to look at what we can contribute to that European defence, and clearly the nuclear deterrent is the key part of that. But then, for example, in the army, do we actually need a full spectrum army, a full spectrum? No, we don't. We need to plug into our NATO allies and say, what can we deliver well as part of the overall defence against the threat that's coming from not only Russia in Europe, but also and increasingly effects in terms of China, in terms of the North Atlantic, and as we get global warming and the opening of sea lanes. And, the idea that we're going to be sending aircraft carriers around the world, no, we don't. We need to commit them to NATO. And that means some very tough decisions. And actually, in mindset change, I've got to say, we've got to be honest with the public about this, is we're not going to be able to do everything. And there are some hard decisions then to be taken amongst our armed forces, saying to the army, for example, we're not going to be doing that, but what we're going to do this very well, and we're going to actually dovetail that into NATO's commitment, so we're actually going to make a real... So they are big decisions that are going to have to be taken by any government, whoever gets in after the next election. But please let's get away from the myth, and it is a myth, that we're going to be going around the world intervening in every single piece of conflict. I mean, look, for example, of the airstrikes on the Houthis in the last few weeks. We contributed because 4 aircraft, because we were seen to be being alongside the Americans. Well, I say on that thing, what is the strategy there for dealing with that? There is no strategy. Okay, we've bombed the Houthis. Is it going to solve the situation? No, it's not. Does it show Britain is a global power? No, it doesn't. Because, frankly, we haven't got the resources, unless someone's going to say that we're going to have a defence budget which is going to be, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7%. Well, there's no government going to commit that. So I'd say to the benches opposite and to the commentariat in our right-wing press, just be honest with the British people about what to do. We can and have got a valuable role to play within NATO, and we have willing partners who want to work with us. And I'm very excited, certainly, about Sweden and Finland joining. We need to make sure we actually get those commitments. But that is to say, some hard decisions to be taken. And some own truth, some of our armed forces, where we're going to have to, as the chair of the PAC said, there are capabilities we're going to just get out of and say, we're not going to do that, we're going to do this, and we're going to do it well, and we're going to contribute. And that will maximise our influence. Now, in terms of China, and people say, well, do we just forget about the South China? No, we don't. We use our strong diplomacy, our great, fantastic abilities in terms of tech and other things in those areas. But it's not about actually deploying people out there or equipment. And as soon as we get to this reality and wake-up call, frankly, the better. I will always call, and always have done, for more increased defence expenditure, but I won't if it's actually just going to try and plug a vision that's never ever going to be actually achieved. We need to make sure we spend that money well. And it comes on to the point now about skills that my right honourable friend from Warley raised. We need to see any defence expenditure as a potential growth in our economy. But you don't do that if what you're doing is you're giving contracts to the United States or Spain, as in terms of the FSS, and don't actually think we've got to grow our defence industries here. Now, I accept there's got to be international collaboration, but it's got to be give and take. The idea that the French would ever give a contract like FSS to a Spanish shipyard, frankly, is just, laughable, as my Honourable Senator from Warley says. So we need to make sure that we actually invest, because it is about skills, it's about ensuring we've got the workforce. And we've seen the effects when we just pull out this. We cannot, with our skill base, just look at it like a tap. You turn it on when you want it, and when you don't want it, you turn it off again. You can't. We've seen the effects and the costs of that, for example, in the Astute programme, when the Conservative government, again, being political, stopped building submarines. We had the gap in skills, and it's taken all the effort now to rebuild that skill base to ensure that we get that. We've got to have that continual thing. We have got to have a situation where, and it's got to be working with our European allies, whether, the zealots of Brexit and anti-European like it or not. If we're talking about things like stockpiles, we have got to work with those allies and make sure that we actually deliver the supply chain we've got. Now, we now come on to what happens after the next general election. Is there going to be a massive increase in defence expenditure, whoever wins the election? No, there is not. I'm sorry, I haven't got time. Is there going to be a massive increase in defence? No, there is not. We know that. Let's just tell the public that. What we need to ensure is what we do spend, we can actually make sure we have the maximum effect on that. And my right honourable friend who speaks on behalf of the defence, from the Labour Party from the defence, in defence, is got a big job if he gets that. He's got a big job and task facing him if we are successful in the next general election. And my heart does sink a little bit when he talks about reviews. Because, yes, we do need to have a review, but we actually need action very straight away. It is critical now that we take some of the key decisions, and they are going to be very difficult decisions, not just to have with the British people about realistic where Britain is in the world today, but actually with some of the members of the armed forces and the chiefs to say, right, we're going to do this, we're going to do it well, and we're going to make sure that we're a safe nation. Now, is that defeatism? Is that saying Britain's finished? No, it's not. I think we've got a proud future. We've got some great assets in terms of our military, our diplomatic, and our way we do things. But don't delude ourselves that we're going to go back to some pre-Suez or pre-Second World War global Britain in terms of imperialist power. We're just not going to be able to do it. And I think honesty with the British people has got to be that. But speed now has got to do that, because as my right honourable friend from Warley says, things like munition shelling, we can't have a situation where it takes a year for those munition stocks to be replaced. There's a tempo here has got to be increased. So action will be taken very quickly, I think, has got to be. Review and look and study and policy, I'm all in favour of that. It's a thing that we've lacked in the last few years in this country, of any thought out policy work or actually strategy. We need that, but we also need action. So it is a daunting task which is going to face any government after the next general election. But let's be proud of those members of our armed forces who work on our behalf and keep us secure. They don't, there's the impression that somehow talking about defence is about, it's a Conservative issue. I'm sorry, it's not a Conservative issue. There are a lot of men and women of our armed forces come from those poorest, deprived communities in this country and are proud to serve their country. And I think we should be proud of them, give them a clear commitment we've got their backing, our backing, but also clear that we're going to be realistic about the tasks that we ask them to do to keep us safe.
Danny Kruger.
Indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's an honour to take part in this debate, and I pay tribute to the committees, the Defence Committee and the Public Accounts Committee, for what I agree are exceptionally good reports, and echo my friend from Hereford on that point. This is possibly the most important speech I'll give as an MP, and I do so on behalf of the military in my constituency of Devizes. I have the honour to represent the garrison towns of Tidworth and Bulford and Larkhill and others, and I went up on Salisbury Plain recently with Colonel Matt Palmer, who's the commander of the Army South West, and he just showed me with the sweep of his arm where 20,000 of our armed forces live and work. But my friend from Hereford said we're not here just as ambassadors of our constituencies, and I speak in my role as an MP about the essential imperative of national security. But just making another local point, Madam Deputy Speaker, in Devizes constituency is also the site of the Battle of Roundway Down, which was the most successful battle on the Royalist cause in the English Civil War. It gave the southwest to the King for the next 2 years. And I mentioned the Battle of Roundway Down because it was that battle, that defeat of the parliamentary forces, which spurred the reform of the parliamentary army and created the new model army, which of course went on to win the Civil War and transformed the model of the way that the military in this country and indeed across Europe was organised for decades to come. And the lesson of the new model army, of the reforms that happened in very short order in the 1640s, wasn't about a major new doctrine of warfighting. It was just about the imperative of having a well-equipped, well-trained, well-led army, innovative, agile, professional, and with high morale. And we need that again. And I mention it, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's in my mind because yesterday I had the pleasure of attending a session at the Royal United Services Institute, organised by the New Bletchley Foundation, led by Brigadier Nigel Hall, and they issuing a report with input from the Galaxy, a very distinguished former generals and other experts, and Sir Richard Barrons was on the panel, Professor Michael Clark and others. And they put forward, in a very short report, which members can find online, a proposal for a reconfigured army. And the point they made, and it's a point that's been made already repeatedly in this debate, is the simple one, that we have to be ready to fight the war that we wish to deter. We have to be ready to fight the war we wish to deter, and that means really ready. It doesn't just mean ready on paper, ready plausibly in a way that might convince someone on the doorstep that we're making sufficient investments in the army. We need to know that we're ready, and crucially our enemy needs to know that we're ready. And I echo the points made by the Chairman of the Defence Committee and my friend from Rayleigh and Wickford about the fact that our enemy know what our capabilities are. They're not going to be deceived by a spin from a press officer in Whitehall. It is absolutely essential that we really are ready to fight the war. So the sad fact is, and there is no point, given the point I've just made, in sugarcoating this, that we are not ready to fight the war that we wish to deter. And these reports, I'm afraid to say, make that plain. And I have great respect for ministers on the front bench, and I recognise the genuine investments that are going into parts of our armed forces, which are extremely welcome and welcome in my constituency. But the fact is that, as General Barron said yesterday, we are back, and I quote, "We are back in a moment of existential risk, in an era of great power confrontation." So laying aside the fantasies of the post-Cold War world of being somehow beyond war and just of course with this crucial difference of the high-tech domains that we are now coming to terms with. And of course, also unlike the mid-20th century, we've hollowed out our army over the last 30 years, and I echo the very powerful points made by my friend from Rayleigh and Wickford, the comparison with the 1930s, that low, dishonest decade, as it's famously been called. And of course, it's in fact 3 decades that we have suffered disinvestment in. So having acknowledged the major commitments of funding that are being made to the armed forces, I do want to highlight the point that our commitments are insufficient at the moment. And I recognise that abstract percentages of GDP are in a sense secondary to the real question of how we spend money and where it goes. But I do think it is important. And the basic fact is that we do need to be spending more than 2%. We need to be spending more than 2.5%. We need to be spending at least 3%. Madam Deputy Speaker, just consider if the worst comes to the worst and the US does withdraw its NATO commitments, as we hear threatened from time to time. We'd all be needing to reach at least 4% across the NATO alliance if we were just to maintain the current strength that NATO has without the US. Have to give way.
From my honourable friend, and indeed recent meetings I've been at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly are assessing that actually it would be a 5% increase in GDP on top of current spend if the Americans were to pull out.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm grateful to him for that. And of course, you know, these figures seem extraordinarily large to us, but consider if the worst really comes to the worst, and we are actually in a hot war in Europe, we'd be back to spending significantly more. It was 50% of GDP, I understand, during World War II. So these figures are essentially marginal in light of the potential. The point's been made, and it can't be made enough, that before defence gets more money, it does need to spend its own money better. And I echo the points made about the importance of procurement reform. The the Public Accounts Committee report is absolutely damning. A £17 billion deficit between the MOD's budget and its official capability requirements, which is perhaps, as my honourable friend said, an underestimate given the way these numbers are calculated. So I'm very concerned about that. And I'll just make a quick point in passing. I'll be interested in the Minister's thoughts on this when he winds up about the nuclear budget. And the fact is there is real concern, I think, about the way that the replacement of Trident is going to be accounted for. And I think there is a real danger that if that is just part of general MOD capital expenditure, it could end up cannibalising conventional weapons. And it is very important, given the long-standing tradition, that we keep nuclear separate from conventional weapons budgets.
Given what the Honourable Gentleman has just said, would he then agree that it would be good to have tighter scrutiny of that, which might mean a new system set up so that we could look at sensitive matters?
I recognise the point made there, and I will defer to the front bench on what's appropriate in terms of transparency, but I do recognise the point made in her report, and I think in the Defence Committee report as well, about the difficulty of getting information that the committees need in order to do their work. And I recognise that nuclear is identified, obviously, as a separate line within the budget, and it is protected in theory. I'm just concerned about what might be a marginal increase in this enormous budget, around a quarter of our total defence spending. If that increases even marginally and the shortfall has to be made up from our conventional defence budget, then that entails a significant reduction in that conventional spending, which is so important at the present time.
Will you give way?
Perhaps give way.
Very quickly. According to the MOD's own figures in the latest supplementary estimates, the amount that we're spending on what they call the defence nuclear enterprise is now gusting towards 20%. So everything he says about the risk of that gradually eating everything else is entirely correct.
Very grateful. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So if we manage to get the genuine increase in defence spending that is needed, the question then arises how to spend that. Where should the money go? And I hope I say this not just on behalf of the 20,000 or so defence personnel in Wiltshire, but because it's the right thing to do. We need to put people first. And I recognise there has been a significant step change in the doctrine of defence policy in recent years towards the recognition that an army is fundamentally about its people. And I respect that. The fact is, probably because of the many decades of disinvestment, we have a problem of low morale, of low pay, often poor housing, a shoestring training budget, all of which contributes to the recruitment crisis that we have in the armed forces, which my honourable friend mentioned. The fact is, and the PAC report makes this very clear, we are losing people faster than we can recruit them, and that is an entirely unacceptable situation for us to be in. We absolutely have to improve recruitment. The Public Accounts Committee, I understand, heard that we are, for every 5 people recruited to the armed services, 8 are leaving. That is a national security crisis, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's not just a problem for recruitment, it's an absolute profound security risk. So I think, and I recognise the point she made about we've had too many reviews, so I hesitate to use the word. If I can think of another word, I would. We need a very quick, total review of the people issue in our armed forces. It can be done quickly, and all it probably entails is a sort of amalgamation of all the work that's been done by others, but I would like to see it with a great degree of urgency, looking at recruitment, terms and conditions, families, crucially, onward progression in all 3 services, so that we can instil with the urgency that is required to turn around the recruitment crisis we're in. So, having made the general point about the importance of investment in people, come quickly to the 2 major services of the armed forces. Firstly, the Navy, and it is of course important that we invest in all 5 domains, including in the grey zone, the sub-threshold activity. It is so important. But our principal specialism in the United Kingdom, historically and now, remains our sea power. And I think it is a very good thing that we are moving towards a maritime strategy. I recognise that that is the priority of the government, and I say this as a representative of a landlocked county which has all these soldiers in it. Nevertheless, I recognise we need significant investment in the Navy, and I'd like to see more. We'd all like to see these things, but let's actually do it. Let's have more submarines, more escorts, more minesweepers. We need seabed warfare vessels. And I just on that point of the seabed, when it's Deputy Speaker, I just call the attention of the House to a report from Policy Exchange a month or so ago talking about the Western approaches and the very significant threat that we face in these islands and indeed across Europe from the threat to the undersea infrastructure that is fundamentally our responsibility on behalf of Europe to protect. So on the Army, mentioned the new model Army and the new Bletchley report, I would like to see a real commitment to a reformed and modernised Army. We've got to recognise Nick Carter's point, former CDS, said that the Army is the weakest of the three services. This is a sad state of affairs. I suppose one of them's got to be the weakest. I'm sorry, it's the Army. There are big questions over our ability to field a division in Europe, as promised to NATO. According to a senior US officer, the UK can't even be called a Tier 1 power. And I understand that the committees were told by a former commander of the Joint Forces Command that our Army won't be ready to fulfil its NATO commitments until the early 1930s. And indeed, that was the assumption of the integrated review. So we are in a sense back to 2030. So we are in a sense back to the 10-year rule, which is not how things should be. Did I say 1930s?
You did.
I think we're up to speed on that. 2030. So the case for investment in the Army is very, very obvious, and the good news is that it is easier and quicker and cheaper to refit and to upscale the Army than it is for the Navy. The kit is smaller and cheaper. But we don't just need the same Army, but bigger. We need a medium-sized Army, bespoke for the job that will be done. I think the member for North Durham made the point right about the sort of Army that we need. It needs, of course, in the resonant phrase, to defend these islands, but it also needs to act in partnership with other services and with our allies in the West. We don't need another great new major continental army like the Poles are building. We need a rapid reaction, joint expeditionary force, agile, mobile, able to do the job that's required in partnership with our allies. And quickly on the sphere of operations, ultimately our commitments need to reflect the threats that we face. And in a sense, those are classified. And I recognise the challenge that the committees have had about identifying what our capabilities are given the tasks that ultimately the ministers set for them, and we can't always know exactly what these are. These defence planning assumptions being classified now. Nevertheless, I think it is fair to say, and I must say, echo the point made by the gentleman for North Durham. I'm delighted about AUKUS. I think it's a tremendous step forward in our international role, and it's a great thing for British security. So I'm not averse to these global arrangements. They're absolutely right. And I love the deployment of the Queen Elizabeth and the Carrier Strike Group to Japan. I thought that was lovely. But fundamentally, we are committed, and we should be committed to the defence of the Euro-Atlantic area. And for that purpose, and I'll be winding up now, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have to restore the mass of our own armed forces and our own army, and that means growing our capabilities here at home. More regulars. We need to get back towards 80 or 90,000 regular forces. We need to grow the reserve force. 30,000 is not enough, even if that 30,000 are real, which I don't believe it is. We need to significantly grow the reserve force. And I think a campaign to grow our reserves is necessary, not just for its own sake, but it's a great exercise in communication to the public about the imperative of us all to step up and play our role in the defence of our country. And there is a great deal of concern, I think misplaced, about the attitude of the British people to fighting. Of course, we had this in the 1930s too. Lots of people saying the British wouldn't fight. Of course they would, and of course they did. And of course they will, if they have to, answer their country's call. Young people in particular. They'll do it with irony, perhaps certainly with memes, but they'll do it. They'll sign up if they need to. And because this is not an abstraction. We already have seen in this last year or two what war in our region means. It means inflation. Imagine that imagine that tenfold if war breaks out, in which our country is directly involved. Cyber attacks on a terrible scale. So we are now at a turning point, as so many members have said, and it is a time for all of us as a country to step up. This is an opportunity and an imperative on us to strengthen our nation. That's about industrial resilience. It's about our own food supply. It's about our supply chain. It's about our steel capacity, about our manufacturing capacity. There is a huge opportunity, as the Honourable Lady said, about the importance of the industrial supply chain. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the time for us all to do what's needed.
Order. I am getting concerned because whilst I have not got a problem with interventions at all, some of the speeches not being 13 minutes, they're being 16 minutes, and that means that we've got pressure then on the front benches to be shorter than we'd hope them to be. So if colleagues do take interventions, please just try to keep still within the limit, because I've got another debate which was due to start at 3 o'clock, and I'm going to have to get as near to that as I possibly can. Richard Foord.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to first up echo the very positive words that have been spoken already this afternoon about these reports from PAC and from the Defence Committee. I think it's really timely that we get all this put out into the open. During the budget earlier this month, the Chancellor of the Exchequer said that defence spending would rise to 2.5% as soon as economic conditions allow. My opening question to the Minister is, what indications has he had from the Prime Minister and from the Chancellor about when economic conditions might allow? What conditions are those that might allow, and when might they be met? This week, the Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, the Honourable Member for Hackney South and Shoreditch, gave an interview to the I newspaper where she described big nasties facing public spending. In the interview, the Chair of PAC talked about slow politics, where decisions are made with a long-term strategic perspective at the forefront. This is something which is especially pertinent when it comes to defence capabilities. As we're entering a period of global uncertainty, it's concerning to read in the PAC report that there are some glaring discrepancies around how spending is identified for single services. So, for example, the report highlights that the way that planned spending is reported for the Royal Navy includes all costs in its plans, creating an on-paper deficit of over £15 billion, whereas for the Army it only includes what estimates it can afford, resulting in a running deficit of about £1.2 billion. Had the Army followed the same procedures as the Royal Navy, we would see the Army deficit soar to over £13 billion. Now, this inconsistency in budget reporting is, as I'm certain, not a deliberate lack of transparency, but it can bring about distrust when it comes to planned defence spending. The Defence Committee's Ready for War report stresses the need to replenish our much-depleted munitions stockpiles. The Defence Committee report highlights that there has been a hollowing out that we've heard talked about, including from the dispatch boxes, over the past 14 years, but this has been brought into sharp relief by an emboldened, aggressive nationalist Russian state. If we cannot coordinate defence spending in a clear manner, we risk weakening the perception of our defence capabilities. The issue of the budget deficit goes further, with the PAC highlighting a £16.9 billion deficit over 10 years, which is due in part to rising inflation. Now, we know of defence that defence inflation is greater than other measures of inflation, partly because a lot of our defence equipment is imported from overseas, particularly from the United States. There is a 62% increase in the spending on the Defence Nuclear Organisation, and the report states that defence spending would need to increase to around 2.5% to plug this gap. Ministers are entrenching the uncertainty around budget planning, meaning that important projects risk being deprioritised. At present, the defence budget is thought to be about 2.1%, and some measures try to include our defence commitment to Ukraine so that it might rise to 2.25%. The MOD said that the difference between that, 2.25%, and 2.5% of GDP is about £6 or £7 billion. There are important reasons why this increase might be necessary, because while we do spend 2.1% on defence as a whole, around 6% of that goes to fund our nuclear capabilities. And prior to 2010, the UK's strategic nuclear deterrent was kept out of measures of Ministry of Defence spending and was held centrally, whereas now it's all included in the defence budget, which means that our conventional spending has really seen a great deal of squeeze over the last decade plus. By failing to invest in our armed forces over a sustained period, we've heard cries of operational readiness being being implicated and people crying overstretch. Now, this word overstretches is one that I recall from my own service. About 20 years ago, people were declaring that the armed forces were running hot, that they were overstretched. But this is why it is essential for governments to know how much they can commit their armed forces. And this comes back to what we used to call the defence planning assumptions, about how many operational overseas deployments might take place simultaneously. Up until 2015, those defence planning assumptions were published, but from 2015, they have not been published. They have been very much held behind a cloak. And I don't see any real reason from a security perspective, from the point of view of what our adversaries might think, of keeping those withheld. Because, as was pointed out to the Defence Committee, our adversaries probably know our own capabilities very well, and they are also going to be analysing our intentions. It's arguably better to be transparent around those defence planning assumptions, if that then means that the call on the armed forces by other departments of government is reduced. And we've seen this a lot in recent years, where other departments have sought to use the armed forces for military aid to the civil authority, perhaps if it's ambulance strikes, or perhaps to cover for the fire service. We've seen the armed forces pulled in, taken away from training, which is absolutely essential to their mission, and used for these other roles. Transparency is very much something that I do think is required. Combined with the persistent issues of repeated cuts and reduction of personnel, our armed forces could be in an even more challenging place than is currently suggested, and we really need to sort this out. The Right Honourable Member for Rayleigh and Wickford refers to the Secretary of State for Defence and his recent speech about moving from a post-war period to a pre-war era. And I was quite alarmed to hear that speech, because I'm personally an advocate for that Roosevelt phrase, speak softly and carry a big stick. And what I felt the Defence Secretary was doing in talking about moving from post-war to pre-war is doing quite the reverse of the walking softly and carrying a big stick, but rather investing no new money in defence while simultaneously speaking with a rather loud mouth. It strikes me that the Defence Secretary is actually not doing enough to advocate for spending in private, because he's doing it in public, through leaked letters to the Chancellor, as reported in the Daily Telegraph. And it seems to me that the Defence Secretary's predecessor, the Right Honourable Member for Preston North, did the honourable and decent thing and stepped away from his Cabinet role when he could no longer tolerate Cabinet collective responsibility in relation to defence spending. I give way.
Yes, well, the honourable member agreed that the strategy is employing is nothing to do with defence, but possibly a future bid to become leader of the Conservative Party.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Member, and while I can't speculate on the intentions of the Defence Secretary, I certainly think it's had the effect of putting him out of step with the Chancellor and with the Prime Minister, and such that he is no longer engaged in collective responsibility. And it seems to me that the government is hiding behind recent high inflation by talking up increases in the defence budget in cash terms rather than real terms. I'd like to give the House a specific example. Following the publication of the PAC report on the 8th of March, the Prime Minister's spokesperson was asked to respond to that report. And the Prime Minister's spokesperson replied, "We are ensuring that we have had the largest defence budget in history." This is so much spin as to be like a vortex. It is completely way off to suggest that. We've already heard from the Right Honourable Member for New Forest East that during the Cold War, defence spending in this country was north of 6% of GDP. Now, I'm not advocating for defence spending to return to anything like those levels, because I recognise that what we were dealing with then was an Eastern Europe that was in the grips of Russia and very much surrounded and part of the Warsaw Pact. And so all of those contributions were assisting the Warsaw Pact inventory, whereas now they're very much contributing to the NATO defence of Europe and the deterrence of Moscow. Yet this phrase, as soon as economic conditions allow, I would understand that formula if we were talking about perhaps an absolute cost, the cost of a frigate, the cost of a platform with a price tag. But we're not. We're talking about a relative cost. And so economic conditions allow mean that the government needs to set out what those economic conditions are. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like just to turn in my last couple of minutes to talking about land in particular and about the Army, which, as we've heard rehearsed in here many times, is being reduced from 82,500 to 73,000 soldiers. Mr. Deputy Speaker talked earlier this afternoon about how there is considerable expertise in this place, but I think actually the greatest defence experience is probably in the other place. It's those who rose to the top of their professions in the armed forces who now speak with the greatest wisdom on defence. And so I'd like to quote from a couple of them. In fact, I'd like to quote from 3 former chiefs of the General Staff. To begin with Lord Richard Dannett, who in January of this year said, "The bottom line is numbers do matter. And it is a fact," he said, "that 73,000, the British Army has never been smaller." Lord David Richards, the former Chief of Defence Staff, said in March 21, "Mass still matters." General Sir Nick Carter, again former CDS, said in May 2022, "It's in the order of 80,000 soldiers that's required to ensure the UK could field a full division as part of a combined NATO force." And although the current Chief of the General Staff is somewhat restricted in what he can say while still in that post, he said in June 2022, "The UK is facing a 1937 moment, and it would be perverse if the CGS was advocating reducing the size of the army as a land war rages in Europe." So I would advocate very firmly for the army to be restored to that 83,000 figure. And to finish, Madam Deputy Speaker, when will those economic conditions be met that we might see 2.5%? Thank you.
Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I give thanks to my right honourable friend for Horsham for leading this debate today with his report. In January 2022, it was the first Thursday back in January 2022, many of us today in the Chamber were in this room. This was 6 weeks before Russia further invaded Ukraine. And there was a debate took part that day about we must increase defence spending because we were already in a Cold War scenario. And there was an argument about that. Were we in a Cold War scenario? Weren't we in a Cold War scenario? And we came back to the same thing about, well, it's all very well talking about increasing spending, but where do the threats lie? Now, the mea culpa from my point of view was that I was saying right up to the 22nd of February 2022, I don't believe that Putin is going to invade Ukraine. I don't think he will. I think he's testing the borders. I think he's seeing where the strengths are. I think he's doing that. And I learned an important lesson that day. I learned the important lesson that politicians often will use the word think when the word they should be using is hope. And a lot of this debate is based around what we want to see happen, what we hope will happen. And we say, well, I think, perhaps we don't need to expand the military as much as that. Perhaps the money is better off being spent there because, are we really going to go nuclear? Is he really going to do that? For example, we talk about the High North and the development in the High North and maritime. Perhaps we need more navy. It's going to become a much more critical area in our security, our trade and our defence. And we hear the same thing. Yeah, but it's highly unlikely. I don't think there's going to be a surface warfare battle. Well, nobody thought there was going to be a tank battle in Europe. Nobody thought there was going to be an armoured vehicle and troop battle and trench warfare in Europe again since the Second World War. But it has happened. I've been asked recently, are we going to have World War III? It's an interesting question. How do we define World War III in the 21st century? Is it the nuclear Armageddon that people think it's going to be? No, I don't believe that. I'll come on to that a bit further. But is it going to be several instances, wars, armed conflicts in several areas that affect our country directly then yes, I believe that that is where the world is moving to, especially when we look at the supply chains happening around the world. And it's not just an effect on this country, and it will lead to other investments having to be made, but there is a famine taking place in Sudan because of what is happening in the Red Sea. Supplies are being reduced in getting there. There is a consequence in many areas of the world when these events take place. And I believe that therefore, if we talk about is there a world war and are we going to be involved, well, we are really. We're in the Red Sea. We're giving support to Ukraine and other areas which build up. And we should not look at Ukraine as an individual thing that Putin's talking about, and that ridiculous interview he did with Tucker Carlson when he was talking about, I haven't got any intentions to invade anywhere else. He literally wrote it down on a piece of paper in July 2021. I mean, it literally takes about half an hour to read, and it's laid out line by line. Not only do we need to rebuild the Russian Empire, but we need to reunite the historic Russian-speaking people. We heard all of these laid out on another book 100 years earlier, and we all know where that led to, and we all know the consequences of us not preparing for that, because there is something that has been forgotten and is overlooked about NATO. Everybody talks about Article 5. An attack on one is attack on another, and we come to the rescue. The rescue. Everybody forgets Article 3, which says you have to be able to defend your borders first and foremost. There's only 14 articles in the Washington Treaty. It's actually a very well-written treaty. And Article 3 makes it clear that you have to be able to defend your borders, and that Article 5 is a reinforcement that can take up to 3 weeks to arrive. And here's the next question. Do we believe that if Putin invades, say, the Baltic states, that that's where the effect on NATO is going to be? Because that would be tactically daft by Putin. What is more than likely going to happen if he decides he's going to invade NATO territory is that he wants to tie the whole of the NATO allies up to start with. And I don't think, there's good news and there's bad news here. If we take the good news that because of what China have said to Putin, because of the trade with India, the South Americas, Southern Africa, and the Chinese especially made it crystal clear. If he was to even demonstrate his ability to use a nuclear weapon, say in the middle of the Black Sea, that's it, we are gone, we are not dealing with you. That has probably taken the nuclear weapon issue off the table in many ways, especially with strategic nuclear weapons. Now, by the way, don't want the House to get excited saying we don't need to renew Trident, because there's still plenty of places around the world who are pushing that territory. And of course, as we always come back to, Trident is a deterrent weapon. It's not a weapon to be used to actually launch, because if it does, well, quite frankly, we're not going to be arguing about it anyway. But it does mean that we actually are in a far weaker position if nuclear is off the table, because he knows it and we know it, and he's doing it right now. He can outproduce shells, tanks, people. They're paying €2,000 a month to people coming in from the far-flung areas of Russia. €2,000 a month. Some of these people don't earn that in a year in some of these places. They've got no shortage of personnel. They've got no shortage of cash. And therefore, we have to start being honest with some of the questions. Do we need to build more capital equipment? Do we need more personnel? Well, yes, we do need more capital equipment, and we're going down it, but we also need the revenue budgets to run it. Following the fiscal rules and saying, well, look how much money we're putting into defence is great, but it has to be capital, because I'm giving the revenue, so let's line up all our shiny ships, but we can't fuel them, we can't maintain them, we can't crew them. It's the same in the Army, it's the same in the Air Force. There has to be a fundamental change at the Treasury as to how the money is spent, because as the Right Honourable Member for North Durham made out, let's have some honesty in this chamber. We sit here and say we need to go to 2.5%, we need to go to 3%, maybe 4%, maybe 5%. So which government and which politician is going to stand up in this House and say, well, that 3% reduction in GDP since in the Cold War has basically gone into the health service and DWP, So we're going to cut the health service and DWP by 3% to invest it in defence. Who's going to stand up in this chamber and say that? Who's going to put that in their manifesto? So let's not pretend that that is what is going to happen, but it does need to be spent more efficiently. And my honourable friend, the procurement minister, has done an excellent job in the integrated procurement model and talking about some of the things which need to be done for a long time, for example, the spiral of development. If we go back, we're very fond of talking about where we were in the 1920s, 1930s. I'll take you back even further to the 1910s when they brought out the Dreadnought model. You know, HMS Dreadnought was the most incredible ship ever built in terms of its firepower. But it hit the reset button because it made every other ship irrelevant. It could sink all of them. So it hit the reset button. So then there was an arms race. Within 8 years, HMS Dreadnought was useless. HMS Iron Duke, which was still a Dreadnought class, was a totally different ship. But it had been part of the design process along. But bear this in mind, we were still only producing 4 Dreadnought battleships a year when we were chucking all our efforts in leading up to 1914 and beyond. I spoke recently at a dinner, and a young person in their early 20s said to me, well, what do you think about this comment from General Saunders about conscription? He said, because there's no way I would be conscripted to go and fight for this country. Why should I bother? I'm not going out to get killed. You know, it's not worth it. You know, you spend all this money here, you waste money there. What are you offering me? It's not worth it. That's what they said. I said, but the problem is, you're looking at it in the society you live in today. If you are going to get conscripted, it's because our cities will lay in rubble. You only have to look at Kiev. Forget wanting to sit at home and watch Netflix, play the Xbox, do anything you want. There's no electricity. There's no water. There's no gas. There's no heating. The starvation, that is happening in Europe today. So how does one stop that happening? Well, the word is deterrent. You know, I have never met a senior military personnel or any officer or even most military personnel who are nothing at heart really pacifists. They understand what warfare means. They understand the death and destruction that it brings and the decades it takes to recover from it. Yeah. They don't want to go to war. I've actually never met anybody in the military who wants to go to war. But that does take investment. But the honesty that we are not going to cut health and we are not going to cut DWP, some of our biggest spending budgets, to spend it on defence means we have to work with what we've got. Now, yes, we can grow the economy and we can take more tax revenue, so we do all of that. But that's not really happened in the 21st century. Yeah. And the 21st century has roughly been 50-50 between that side of the house and this side of the house. And even when it has grown, it's been around the margins. So there has to be that honest conversation. I believe what my honourable friend has produced in terms of the procurement strategy is the right way forward, because we are aware of the costs that exist. But the only thing I would say is this, almost in direct contradiction of myself. The war in Ukraine has shattered that economy. The percentage cost in GDP, forget spending it on fighting the war, the loss in GDP of being able to run an economy and export and do things when you are at a war, is significantly bigger than an increase in 2 or 3%. But be under no illusion. If Putin wants to invade NATO territory, it is not tanks rolling over the line up in the Baltics or maybe in East Poland and we have to go out there and do it. It will be a full-scale NATO attack. And we will have to work out what we do. And the best way, because they have no idea when or where we would strike back from, and therefore has made it a useless weapon to use. But we have to have that weapon. But if we say that is cancelled out because of the attitudes of China and Russian allies towards them if they were to use one, then we have to accept that our conventional weapons are not the counterbalance to Russia and what's happening. And nobody in this chamber, and nobody in the military, and nobody at the MOD, and nobody in Europe, and probably nobody in any of the Western world wants to go to war and see death and destruction on the scale that we're seeing in too many areas of the world, We see famine, we see the humanitarian crisis taking place. So yes, we are going to have to spend more money. but we need to spend it more efficiently. We need to make sure that where the increases come, they're going to be used effectively. And we need to make sure that we always remember that this investment is so that we don't have to use it. But if we don't have it, we will have to end up using something we don't actually have.
On that surreal note, let me quote Rudyard Kipling. We don't want to fight, but by jingo, if we do, we've got the men, we've got the ships, and we've got the money too. There's plenty of jingo, Madam Deputy Speaker, but of course the men, the ships, and the money are more difficult to find. Some of the fantasy talk in this debate, I genuinely hope, is widely seen by the general public. It was a Gilbert and Sullivan performance as they first conceded that our weaknesses are such we need to conceal them in the report. That's what the Right Honourable Gentleman for Rayleigh said in an intervention. We've had to conceal the extent of our weaknesses in this report. No, I won't. I'm mindful of the Deputy Speaker's injunction that she's fast running out of time, and I don't intend to take my whole 13 minutes. Don't worry, I'll make sure people see the Right Honourable Gentleman's performance. We need to conceal the extent of our weakness, and then he adumbrated our weakness. And if that wasn't our total weakness, if there are weaknesses that he concealed from that list, then I ask myself, why on earth are these people pirouetting in this Parliament about which enemy they're going to fight, in which theatre of war, when they don't...
Point of order, Mark Francois.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll keep this very brief. For the record, the gentleman opposite has traduced me. He's literally said directly the opposite, as Hansard will show, of what I actually said.
Thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for that point of order. I think he's used it to make his point, but I will return to George Galloway.
Pomposity, but not a point of order. The Right Honourable Gentleman said we were careful to conceal some of our weaknesses, and then he adumbrated those weaknesses, and if there are more that he concealed, we're in very big trouble. But my point is this: we haven't the men, we haven't the ships, we haven't the money. So why are we picking enemies? I've lost count of the number in the course of this debate that we are either already fighting or may have to get ready to fight. That's the absurdity, the Alice in Wonderland nature of this debate. We can't retain even the low numbers of people that we recruit. Why? We ought to know why. The lions don't much like the look of the donkeys that lead them into war after war, which they later disown and admit should never have been fought. You know, Madam Deputy Speaker, to what I refer. I had a debate in the Oxford Union. The then Defence Secretary ran away, didn't turn up. I had to deal with his subordinates. But I made the point there. I was a boy soldier, Royal Artillery Battery 2, Army Cadet Force. I trained with the Royal Marines for weeks in Poole in Dorset. I am in no sense a pacifist. I want to defend our country. I want our soldiers to be properly paid, properly housed, properly clad, properly trained, properly armed. I've picked up Tommy Atkins, you know, stricken with addiction from Piccadilly Gardens, in Manchester, just out of strange ways, addicted to spice, abandoned by the politicians, that gaily sent them off to one needless, pointless, fruitless war after another. Don't come here and say you're standing up for Tommy Atkins. It's the donkeys that sent them to wars that even those donkeys now disavow that are the reason people don't join our armed forces. They don't trust these people over here not to send them into another Iraq, not to send them into another Afghanistan, and they are right not to trust them. The truth is that our country is in very real danger of falling into the trap of Mussolini, going around the world threatening people with Germany's army. Our politicians go around the world threatening people with America's army. But there's a big change coming, Madam Deputy Speaker. They don't like it on either side of the aisle. But President Trump is coming back in November, and he doesn't much fancy their NATO. He doesn't intend to send American soldiers to die for Kupiansk or for the Zelensky regime in Kiev. He has no intention whatever of continuing their war in Ukraine. And I heard a senior member of the House say, if America withdraws from NATO, we are going to have to increase our contribution to 5%, 6%, maybe 7% of GDP. These people seriously imagine that they'll continue NATO without the United States of America? What kind of NATO would that? It would really be Gilbert and Sullivan. Unless, of course, we're going to devote not 50 billion of our public treasure, but hundreds of billions of our public treasure on defence. Well, have any of these people seen the state of the public realm in Britain? Have they seen the state of the National Health Service? Have they seen the state of our streets, our public buildings, our public transport? Have they seen the wage packets being earned in this country? Have they seen pensioner poverty? Have they seen fuel poverty in action? Have they met people that have to choose between eating and heating? And these fools want to spend not 50 billion, but hundreds of billions on weapons of war that we're going to fight with an army that could fit into Villa Park. 70,000 soldiers can fit into a single football stadium. Madam Deputy Speaker, I was for some time the Member of Parliament for a naval shipbuilding yard, Yarrows on the Clyde, producers of excellence. I wrestled, not physically, but I wrestled with our late and lamented friend, Alan Clark, when he was the Minister for Procurement. And I won. I got all 5 of the Type 23s that were procured at that time. I want us to have a good Navy. I want us to have a good army. But not so we can sail it to bombard the natives in the Red Sea. Not so we can send a Gilbert and Sullivan squadron to the South China Sea like a pea shooter firing at an elephant, or a whale, in fact, in the case of the Chinese Navy. Not so we can pretend that our 70,000 soldiers and our aircraft carriers that break down and have to be glued together, our destroyers that crash into each other in the Solent. Not because I want to pretend we are a Rudyard Kipling era imperial power. That is the key problem, Madam Deputy Speaker. Some of these people still think we are in the 19th century, that we can send gunboats up the Yangtze and not have them sunk that the natives in the Yemen are the natives we used to push around for a century or more. The empire strikes back, you know. The empire's actually bigger than us now. We owned India, now the Indians own us. Shall I take that metaphor further? The idea that this little country of ours, this dear green place of ours, with all of its problems and its enfeeblement caused by our economic decline and the rapid and massive economic advance of others, is still in a position to stand in this Parliament, making dispensations to this battleground or that we can still slice our diminishing national wealth in a way that allows us to pretend to be an imperial power. I have time only for one last point. I was startled by the Right Honourable Lady, the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, when she told us that 2 billion of our defence budget is going on foreign exchange costs, meaning that not only are we spending 50 billion of British taxpayers' pounds, we're spending it in foreign countries. We're allowing foreign companies and yards to build our defence infrastructure in a way, as the Honourable Gentleman, the Right Honourable Gentleman from North Durham pointed out, in a way that France would never dream of doing. So whatever we're going to spend it in Britain, spend it in British yards, in British factories. You'll save 2 billion in foreign exchange costs at the very least.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I genuinely will not take 13 minutes in my contribution. Our armed forces give it their all every single day for our protection. Their level of commitment and courage, sadly, is not one matched by this government. Worse, as our Defence Committee report and the reports from my Honourable Friends Committee shows, this government have presided over reductions in personnel, depletion of kit and delays in new capabilities. When it comes to the biggest threat of all, war, there isn't a single service that's fully ready. This did not happen overnight, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a culmination of, to use the words of the former Defence Secretary, the hollowing out of our forces over the last 14 years. The new Defence Secretary rightly said, we are in a pre-war world. But to acknowledge this and then do nothing about it is negligent. The world is in turmoil. War in Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East, fear of conflict in the Indo-Pacific, an aggressive Russia, an unpredictable China, as well as our armed forces responding to humanitarian missions and MACA requests as they did throughout the pandemic. This all makes this pre-war footing all the more urgent. Yet, and this is not an exhaustive list, but when it comes to our Royal Navy, there are delays to the Type 26 frigates, issues with the availability of SSNs, delays to Dreadnought, and an over-reliance on RFA Fort Victoria. Our Royal Air Force has a shortfall in fixed-wing transport aircraft numbers, insufficient numbers of maritime patrol aircraft and wedge-tail airborne early warning systems, a lack of air-to-air refuelling and a lack of ground-based air defence systems or an anti-ballistic missile capability. Our Army also lacks infantry fighting vehicles, multiple launch rocket systems, Challenger tanks and armoured fighting vehicles. Whilst we have rightly committed ammunition to Ukraine, the 1.95 billion announced to replenish stockpiles wasn't ring-fenced, and we've heard the MOD is potentially using this to help offset funding shortfalls instead of using it to restore our war-fighting ability. Our lack of industrial capacity is also causing problems, with replenishment in particular, as many companies, both at the prime and subprime level, are facing challenges in scaling up and a failure to address supply chain issues represent a significant risk to production. And as my honourable friend's PAC report on the MOD's equipment plan found, there is no credible of 4,660 per year from our armed forces. There are significant pinch points in cyber, digital and AI skills. Those who serve in our forces are exceptional people, but they are constantly being asked to do more with less. The result has been significantly low morale, recruitment and retention issues across our services and across the reserves. Our report, Madam Deputy Speaker, notes that either the Ministry of Defence must be fully funded to engage in operations whilst also deploying warfighting readiness, or the Government must reduce the operational burden of our armed forces. Of course, these are difficult decisions to make, but it's obvious this Government aren't going to make them, as they are limping towards electoral oblivion. Frustratingly, the Government have hindered our inquiry considerably in not sharing with us the information they hold on readiness, information which used to be available. Worse still, they were unable to explain to us why this information has now become classified. Bearing in mind, as our allies and countries at greater risk than us share theirs, it is fair to conclude that the reason this information isn't being shared is because readiness levels are far worse than even we conclude in our report. Because our conclusion, bluntly speaking, is that we are not ready for war. The recent budget saw no increase for defence, and that's after the cuts referred to by my right honourable friend from North Durham. Just this week, ex-defence and security chiefs have said we must prepare genuinely for war. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, we don't have the personnel or the kit to be ready for war. And far worse than that, we do not have the right government in place to be ready for it either.
Minister looks as though he was escaping there. Before I call the SNP front bench, just to say the front bench contributions are longer than normal, but we will be able to finish the debate by 3 o'clock, as I'd indicated. So the SNP is going to have 10 minutes, the opposition 15, and the government 15. SNP spokesperson Martin Docherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, this was a debate that certainly went in directions I never thought it would go. It's always a privilege to follow the Honourable Member for South Shields, who is maybe in a different party, but also a very good friend on the committee. And may I commend the report from the committee, in which I am once again a member. There are a few things we don't agree on, but in the vast majority of issues we do. And that brings me back to the old Scottish motto. The nation's motto is "in defence." And I am very much akin to that. And I think I do also share some of the issues made by the member for Rochdale about how we don't push ourselves into conflicts that are unnecessary. And I may come back to that in a few moments. But I maybe want to come back to the points made by, I think, the Right Honourable Member for Rayleigh and Wickford in relation to background and family. Now, I've said it umpteen times in the Chamber that my brother served in Iraq. He had 2 terms in Afghanistan as a reservist. And I'll come back to that specific point around people in the armed forces later. And I'm also mindful when he talked about his dad. My dad's 90, and I'm lucky my dad's still here, but my dad survived the worst aerial bombardment these islands has ever seen, and which is now only about 75 years after the point it was rectified. It was mentioned by the government was the worst aerial bombardment the UK had ever seen during the Second World War. And I was able to attend, as I try and do every year, last Wednesday, the 83rd commemoration of the Clydebank Blitz, which took place on the 13th and 14th of March 1941, and also stood at the mass, one of the mass graves in Clydebank on Saturday to lay a wreath on behalf of my constituents, and I do so with privilege and in honour of a family of survivors. I want to maybe pick up 3 points in terms of people, partnership and position. in terms of the issues around readiness, and how it also links critically to the word resilience, which I think I heard some members mention. And I do think that the Honourable Member for North Durham and probably the Right Honourable Member for Warley will probably sick to the death of me talking about resilience over several years, because it's inextricably linked to what readiness should be all about. So let me talk about people first and how resilient are the armed forces. And it's a pity that I know that the Honourable Member for Wrexham can't be here today, and I have mentioned that I would mention her today because she chaired a subcommittee on women in the armed forces, which exposed some of the most profoundly difficult questions about recruitment and retention that the armed forces has ever had to face in terms of scrutiny in this Parliament. And I think issues around retention, critically in that report, and I hate the term, the ordinary ranks. What does ordinary mean? People on the front line who have to go over the ditch. There's nothing ordinary about that. As I mentioned, my brother did it himself as a reservist. But women and minority ethnic communities, that report exposed dreadful issues around why we're not retaining or even recruiting women specifically, or people from black minority ethnic communities. Why are young men not wanting to join up? It comes back to the issue that I've often talked about around terms and conditions. Now, I do remember that a former chair of the Defence Select Committee who is not here, although I do see the Honourable Gentleman for New Forest East has turned up, but one of the former Defence Select Committee chairs was also a former minister. And I remember arguing with him when he said that members of the armed forces are not employees or workers. That might be the case in terms of the law, but they still deliver a service. And that's why I think it's critically important, if you want to retain people, you actually copy the issue that so many of our NATO allies do around recognising the value and worth of members of the armed forces, whether it be the Royal Navy, whether it be the Army or even the RAF, and recognise their rights. And that's a right to representation. And that's why I and my party have always said that we believe that the armed forces require an armed forces representative body such as the Police Federation. Indeed, nations like the Kingdom of Denmark, which paid the blood price in Iraq and Afghanistan, it has a very robust armed forces representative body, and their problem is not about recruitment, it's about how in God's name do you actually get people to leave the armed forces in Denmark, because they're such a good, wait for it, employer, and they're still willing to go over the ditch and take up the cudgel on behalf of their country. And that also comes back to about how you treat people who might, here in the UK, be overly reliant on charitable organisations who are very well-meaning, very well committed. I will give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Would you agree with me, though, and I agree with the points he's making, but it's actually, there's got to be a real radical revolution in the way in which armed forces not only recruit people, but actually employ people. The number of 18-year-olds is going down. We're going to have more flexible employment models where people can leave, come back in, have career breaks, things like that. Unless we do that, we're not going to actually get the individuals to join our armed forces.
I totally agree with the Right Honourable Gentleman. I'm glad that his party's also joined mine, and I think, I don't know if it's still in their manifesto commitment about the issue about our armed forces representative body, but critically about how you utilise the skills that already exist. And it's, I can't believe I'm going to say, using the United States as an example, but it's emulated in the United States, where is that flexibility, and it's also emulated in so many of our NATO allies. So when it comes to readiness, to have people on the front line, a physical armed forces, and I'm not going to go into a numbers game today, because the issue here is a political and philosophical one. It's about how you retain and recruit, and fundamental rights for members of the armed forces, I think, should be enshrined in law. They shouldn't need to go to very well-meaning charitable organisations to receive assistance around housing, their mental health, and even the actual physical health. If you're Danish and you're a member of the armed forces and you've suffered an injury, you don't go to special units. You go to a Danish national hospital like every other Danish citizen, because you get the delivery of a robust public service. And that maybe also comes back to an issue around people in which the armed forces, critically the army, have been challenged during the pandemic. Now, it's all very well meaning, and again I go back to some members, former members of the Defence Select Committee who are not here today, who kept going on about how we need the army to step up to the plate in dealing with resilience. Now, I think the Right Honourable Gentleman for North Durham has heard me talk about resilience before in committee, and it's not, from my perspective, the role of the army to pick up civilian action. If we take the pandemic, for example, in England and Wales, the army had to pick up in terms of the Nightingale hospitals. They not only logistics in terms of the design, but the actual physical infrastructure. And why was that? It's because most parts of the NHS procurement processes to build the Nightingales were privatised years ago. So we had taken that very physical state ownership of that civil structure of resilience and readiness out of the hands of government, out of the hands of the NHS, and given it to private contractors who are making billions on the back of it. Now, in the Scottish example, the Louisa Jordan, the army stepped up to the plate in helping with the logistics. But they were not required to build the Louisa Jordan, the internal structure of it. It was mostly within the Scottish Conference Centre, but the very structure of it internally was built by NHS Scotland Procurement because it was fit and ready for purpose and to play its part. So I think those issues around people is that readiness is not just about members of the armed forces, it's also about the larger civilian infrastructure. Now, I noticed that the Right Honourable Member for Warley is not in her place, but he and I think also with the Right Honourable Member for New Forest East, travelled to Washington some years ago with the Defence Select Committee, and part of that was to an understanding around where our infrastructure is and how, for example, do you translate through partnerships between states, critically within the continent of Europe, how do you transfer, for example, a division or tanks across bridges, across roads, which since the end of the Cold War no longer are equal in terms of weight or infrastructure. So it's how difficult is it to transfer a tank, for example, from a port to the, say, technically the Eastern Front if required. Those kind of lacks of partnership have been allowed to just disappear in that kind of post-Cold War era. And it's really critical, I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we highlight that. But other partnerships are really important, and that's also around the UN and the role of peacekeeping. And therefore, it was really disappointing that not only the UK, but other countries had to pull out of places like Mali, the instance of the Malian government recently in the last couple of years in terms of peacekeeping there, because that's a critical part of the infrastructure of maintaining an international order based on the rules-based system. And indeed, I have to say I was critically disappointed with the government's decision to postpone or abandon its investment in funding for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency in Palestine based on very small amount of information or accusation from the government of the State of Israel in terms of the conflict in Gaza. It was extremely disappointing. I do hope that the government recognise the value and worth of that partnership to try and quell some of the many big issues that are faced in that part of the world. I maybe also want to talk about the European Union briefly. I do think I had 10 minutes, but maybe just slightly. I'll just bring my conclusions to an end, Madam Deputy Speaker, because I think in terms of partnership and position, the European Union, and I'm glad to hear that the official opposition may now be looking at an improved relationship with the European Union. On these benches, we believe it's important to have a mutual defence agreement with the European Union. In terms of also position, I'm a Euro-Atlanticist, and I think it's really important that we reposition that away from the issues around the Indo-Pacific. And just finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do agree with the Honourable Member for Devizes when it comes to the nuclear proposition. I think only I and the Member for Rochdale are opposed to nuclear weapons in the Chamber, but I think there's general agreement here that we need to take the deterrent into another budget heading so that we do have a full understanding of what that 2-point-whatever percentage of GDP is, and I hope that the Government will be able to answer that in the debate today.
Shadow Secretary of State John Healey.
Thank you. Thank you. I started by knocking the water over when I came into the chamber, Madam Deputy Speaker. I finished by doing the same. Thank you for calling me, and thank you to everybody for the contributions today. I want also to thank the armed forces, as we should, for everything they do to keep us safe. Our UK armed forces are essential to not just the defence of our NATO nation, but also to those of our NATO alliance, and also to our UK role in upholding international law. And we respect, as the world does, the professionalism with which they do their job. And I want, Madam Deputy Speaker, also to welcome the further AUKUS agreements that are being signed this week between Australia, the UK and the US. This is our most important strategic defence alliance outside NATO. It is so much more than a big submarine building programme. It demands UK national endeavour and UK national leadership. It has our total Labour support. Madam Deputy Speaker, President Putin claimed 88% of all votes in last week's Russian poll. A total sham of an election, but a serious moment for UK defence. Over the next decade, we face Putin and an alliance of aggression from autocrats who have contempt for international law and who squander freely the lives of their own people. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Chair of the Defence Select Committee started us off, as he said, we should start where all defence debates should start, with the threats that we face. And the threats we face will only increase. That's why we need a new era for defence. That's why these reports are so important and why this debate is so important. And Madam Deputy Speaker, before you took the chair, Mr Deputy Speaker said of this debate, this promises to be one of the best informed from all sides, and he was right. The Honourable Member for Horsham brought his experience not just as a minister but as the Defence Select Committee Chair, and I paid tribute to the fact that we are now agreed that it's right to move away from competition by default. It is right to see the defence sector as he called it, a critical strategic asset, and that is very much a reflection of the work that he has done. Madam Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend, the member for Warley, asked the right question. What are we doing to create new industrial capacity in the UK and in collaboration with close allies? My right honourable friend, the member for Hackney South and Shoreditch, said that she had seen the arguments and excuses and yet no efficiencies arrive, not just captured in her report, the subject to this debate, but 4 other reports her Public Accounts Committee have undertaken into defence procurement since 2019, and 9 National Audit Office reports looking at the same problems. The Honourable Member for Rayleigh and Wickford, very moving speech about his father and his D-Day experience, and I particularly enjoyed the emotive part of his speech where he got stuck into the government and the MOD as well. The Honourable Member for Devizes there, quite right to say, look, we are in a moment now of existential risk, not ready to fight the wars that we may face. And a theme, I think, picked up by his honourable friend, the member for Hereford and South Herefordshire, where he said, we should be looking not just at operational readiness, the subject of the Defence Committee's report, but our strategic readiness. And actually part of that is a responsibility as a nation to develop greater resilience and, interestingly, greater talent, including in our political parties and in this House. My right honourable friend, the member for North Durham, made a very strong argument for defence plans that are based on reality and honesty. Honesty about the UK's role in the world, especially the priority we must give to our role in NATO. And he too said we must see defence investment directed first to benefit the UK economy. The Honourable Member for, Right Honourable Member for Elmet and Rothwell, he too has been a Defence Minister. He leads, I think, the NATO parliamentary delegation from this country. I think he was right to remind us that for NATO member nations, Article 3, the obligation to defend their own country, is as important and fundamental as Article 5, the obligation to defend each other. My honourable friend, the member for South Shields, spoke really in some detail about the equipment shortfalls that the Defence Select Committee's report lays out, and rightly spelled out the concern that the MOD is covering up the scale of these problems by not providing information to the public or to Parliament. And that was echoed by the honourable member for Tiverton and Honiton. He said operational planning assumptions, which up until 2015 were published, are no longer published. And I say to the honourable member for Rochdale, he was right to talk about the concealment of truth about the state of our armed forces. But in fairness to the Honourable Member for Rayleigh and Wickford, that's exactly what the Defence Select Committee, which he played a leading part in producing the report, is arguing that the government is not doing. And I just say to him this: the concern to defend our people and our allies is not Alice in Wonderland or Gilbert and Sullivan. It is what people have a right to expect of their government and of their parliament. And finally, the Honourable Member who speaks for the SNP, with great experience on defence. I followed his 3 Ps, but I was particularly struck by his people. Not just the requirement to do better in recruiting and retaining armed forces, and it's not just about numbers. He argued that it's not just about numbers, but our forces must better reflect the diversity of the people that they serve to protect.
Would the Honourable Gentleman give me briefly on
I will indeed.
I'm very grateful for those words. I would, though, push him on the issue of an armed forces representative body. Is it something that he and his party still remain committed to?
No, Madam Speaker, it's not. We have a much better solution, which is to legislate for an independent armed forces commissioner, like they have in Germany, that will be a voice for armed forces personnel and the families that support them, that will report to Parliament, not to ministers, and in that way we can reinforce the accountability of our military to this House and to the public, as well as make it more responsive to those who serve. And I will come on to some points on that, if I may. Madam Deputy Speaker, I pay tribute to all the contributions to this debate, and particularly from those who are members of the 2 committees on which this debate is based. As they note, there are deep and long-running problems across defence, but I want to marshal my remarks into 3 main areas of findings from both reports. First, the hollowing out and underfunding of our armed forces. Second, defence mismanagement and waste. And third, the increasing lack of openness we've seen in recently from the Ministry of Defence. First, on hollowing out and underfunding. My honourable friend, the member for South Shields, reminded us it was the last Defence Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Wyre and Preston North, who told this House last January the armed forces, he said, have been hollowed out and underfunded over the last 14 years. These reports reinforce that sobering assessment of our UK military power and readiness. The Defence Committee found capability shortfalls and stockpile shortages across the forces, resilience undermined by reductions, a crisis in the recruitment and retention of both regulars and reserves, forces, I quote again, that are losing personnel faster than they can recruit them. But the hollowing out and underfunding is getting worse, Madam Speaker, not better. Capability gaps growing. I'll just finish. The Minister can have his say. I'm quoting the reports at this point. Capability gaps growing, reliance on allies increasing, and now the largest ever deficit of 16.9 billion in the MOD's equipment plan. And the PAC concluded this: there is an unmistakable deterioration in the MOD's financial position. Now, I've also, like the Honourable Member for Rayleigh and Wickford, brought my red book along here, and I've studied Table 2.1 and 2.2. So the Treasury and the House of Commons confirm, the Library confirm, a reduction in defence budgets which will be cut by 2.5 billion in cash terms for this next financial year. This is the budgeted baseline figures on which defence can plan, procure, deploy and develop capabilities, not the one-off add-ons for specific purposes like nuclear or Ukraine. And these are the figures that ministers too often use to inflate the figures of total spending and disguise the real budgets. This is where the country is left after 14 years of Conservative failure on defence. And the Honourable Member for Rayleigh and Wickford said, this is wholly unworthy of a Conservative government. I say this is wholly unworthy of a British government. I will not, because the Minister has 15 minutes in which to make his point. I will give way.
To the honourable gentleman, it's fair that I would come on a specific question. Does he support our target of 2.5%?
Well, as has been pointed out in this debate, 2.5% is an aspiration when economic circumstances allow. No timetable, no plan, no credibility. The last time this country spent 2.5% of GDP on defence was in 2010 under a Labour government. Turning number 2, Madam Deputy Speaker, mismanagement and waste. The Right Honourable Member, my friend from Hackney South and Shoreditch, said mismanagement and waste runs widely across defence. The PAC report found only 2 of the 46 MOD equipment programmes are rated as highly likely to be delivered on time, on budget and on quality. Many defence programmes being delayed and over budget. Madam Deputy Speaker, ministers are failing British taxpayers and failing British troops, but most concerning of all, they have no plan to fix this. And my right honourable friend said, in this debate, one of our major concerns is the MOD are putting off decisions. Serious threats, serious problems, and a serious lack of action from the government to fix them. Finally, turning to the third area of transparency, Madam Deputy Speaker. Civilian authority over our UK military involves accountability of defence to elected civilian ministers, but also to elected members of this House. And reducing MOD transparency is a theme that runs throughout both these reports. The Defence Committee said it was unacceptable. The PAC pointed out that the MOD has refused even to publish a full equipment plan this year, the Minister's responsibility, despite, they say, undertaking the same depth of financial analysis as in previous years. This should worry all members of this House. It's been a growing concern of mine for some months. Days at sea for our Royal Navy ships, MACA agreements struck with other departments. Data that has been published and released to me before is now being withheld. And instead of responding to my written questions, I'm getting ministers now saying, we'll write to you instead. And currently I'm waiting for 26 letters, some of them dating back as far as December, for an answer. Now, there are, of course, legitimate security reasons why some information can't be released, but there are some obvious political reasons why a government nearing an election will not want some of this information to be public. But the Defence Committee, in its report, has an important and clear warning. Madam Deputy Speaker, threats are increasing, just as concerns are increasing at the same time over the state of our armed forces, not just from members of the committees today, not just from members of both sides of the House, but actually from the ranks of the ministerial front benches as well. We've got the Security Minister and the Indo-Pacific Minister and even the Defence Secretary now publicly challenging their own government defence policy in the press. And the Defence Secretary making arguments in the Daily Mail that he failed to win with his own Chancellor. And I do feel for the Minister, to be honest. He's almost the last man standing by the government's own defence policy. Madam Deputy Speaker, in summary, Labour will always do what's required to defend the country. And if we win the confidence of the British people in the next election, my pledge to the British people is this, that Britain will be better defended with Labour. First, we'll reinforce protections for the UK homeland. Second, we'll ensure our NATO obligations are met in full. Third, we will make our allies our strategic strength. Fourth, we will renew the nation's moral contract with those who serve. And fifth, we'll drive deep reform of defence and direct defence investment first to British jobs and British business. This is the way that Labour will make our country secure at home and strong abroad. And Madam Deputy Speaker, we will consult across the House in doing so, because we want our plan, not just to be Labour's plan. We want our plan to be Britain's plan, to be better defended in future.
Minister James Cobb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful to all honourable and right honourable members for their contributions, and I thank all those on the Defence and Public Accounts Committee for their thorough reports on the readiness of the armed forces, defence equipment and inventory management. Now, I've got a lot of time for the right honourable member for North Durham, but I think he did say that our armed forces are a gnat on the backside of an elephant. I'm happy for him to intervene and clarify.
If he actually was listening, what I was saying is our contribution we could make to a crisis in the South China Sea would be a gnat on the backside of an elephant. That's very different to what he's just said.
Well, I'm grateful for his clarification. Either way, I think we can all agree that it's important that we understand the extent to which our armed forces are ready and are actually out there serving the country as we speak. Our continuous at sea nuclear deterrent is entering its 6th decade of service. Our armed forces have helped us become Ukraine's most front-footed ally. We are training more than 60,000 Ukrainian military personnel and have done so since 2014. And we're delivering more than £7 billion of military aid to Ukraine within our overall aid package worth almost £12 billion. And that support is unwavering. I will in shortly. With the recent announcement of our latest £2.5 billion package of military support for Ukraine, which is, I'm just going to make some opening remarks, which is a £200 million uplift on the previous 2 years. Beyond our support for Ukraine, our armed forces are participating in every single NATO mission. But before I come to NATO, I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for allowing me to intervene. I didn't apply to speak in the debate because I couldn't be sure that I would be here at the end. Can I, while he's talking about the threats, ask him to impress on the House how our aid to Ukraine is absolutely vital now, because if Ukraine is successful in thwarting Russia, then all those dread scenarios about an attack on NATO will not happen. Yeah. And similarly, although President Trump is a worry, it is at least a relief that he has begun to make remarks that providing Europe does its bit, he will continue with Americans' support for NATO should he be elected.
Yeah. My honourable friend, he makes an excellent point, and if I may say, the Honourable Gentleman for Rochdale accused us of imperialism in the way that we deploy our armed forces. The whole purpose of our support in Ukraine is precisely to help them resist the imperialism in the Kremlin that he has shamefully supported whilst condemning the so-called regime of Zelensky. We heard him say it, and it's absolutely shameful. But he wouldn't give way to anybody, so if he'll forgive me, I'll continue. Because my honourable friend made another excellent point that actually what we've heard from Donald Trump is a change of tone in recent days. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm delighted to give way to the Honourable Lady.
Lewell-Buck.
For giving way. I believe at the start of his comments, the Minister said it's important to understand how ready our forces are. So can he then tell us why key information on readiness is no longer published and none of it was shared with our committee?
Well, I'm happy to engage with the committee, as I did during the week on AI with the committee that she chaired. Obviously, there will always be a balance to be struck between what we can share and where we have to recognise the sensitivity of defence. But I was talking about NATO. So from the high north to the Mediterranean, we are deploying 20,000 service personnel from our Navy, Army and Air Force on NATO's Exercise Steadfast Defender. This is one of the Alliance's largest ever training exercises, and it is a valued opportunity to strengthen interoperability between us and our allies. And I'm happy to report that as the Shadow Spokesman said, and the Right Honourable Member for Warley, overnight we've had confirmation of a new Defence and Security Cooperation Agreement signed with Australia, which will make it easier for our armed forces to operate together in each other's countries, and it will help facilitate UK submarine crews visiting Australia as part of AUKUS. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, a large number of points obviously made in the debate. I'll try and take as many as I can. The Right Honourable Gentleman, the Chair of the Select Committee and several others, but in particular the Right Honourable Gentleman for Warley, talked about the importance of industrial resilience, and obviously I totally agree with them. In fact, the Right Honourable Gentleman for Warley made an important point about finance. We mustn't forget the role of the private sector in investing into defence, and we have seen commentary on the so-called issue of ESG, and he wanted to see cross-government work on this. I'm pleased to confirm I've worked with my Treasury colleagues. We've held a meeting at Rothschild's in the city to look at what more we can do, and I'm confident we'll be saying more on this very important point of how we make the case for investing in defence as a way of investing in peace. I'll give way to my right friend.
On the point about ESG, there have been many references to the Second World War today. Is it worth reminding the House and the country, if we hadn't have had a defence industry building Spitfires and Hurricanes in 1940, this debate wouldn't be taking place. In fact, this place would no longer exist.
Well, my right honourable friend makes an excellent point, which is why I want to see us supporting our sovereign capability, because where Spitfire was there in the 1930s, hopefully GCAP will be there in the 2030s. I'm afraid, as he's already had an interview, I hope he will allow me, because I want to refer to comments from colleagues. Now, there was obviously particular debate on the issue of spending. Whilst the Shadow Secretary of State was unable to answer whether Labour would match 2.5%, a number of my colleagues did want us to go further and faster. Actually, I thought this point was very well put by an honourable member for Tiverton and Honiton, because the Chair of the Select Committee and others have suggested that we look back at the sort of GDP figures in the Cold War, not necessarily saying going exactly to that amount, but as the honourable gentleman for Tiverton Honiton said, who I think was in military intelligence, of course, in those days, all of Eastern Europe pretty much was an armed camp full of Soviet divisions, whereas now those countries are in NATO. So the situation has changed quite profoundly. And as my right honourable friend, one of my predecessors in NDP, said quite rightly, if we increase defence by a significant amount, the money does have to come from somewhere. An increase from the current level of around 2.3% to 3% is £20 billion. That's not a small amount of taxpayers' money. Even to 2.5% is an extra £6 billion. So it's government policy to support that, but to do so when we believe the economy can support it over a sustained basis. Several have said, as my right honourable friend for Rayleigh and Wickford did in a very passionate speech, about the fact that in the budget effectively it was a cut. I don't agree. Now, I accept there is a debate about this. I think it's about, it's about the difference between the main estimate and the supplementary estimate. Some people have said it's about inclusion of nuclear. To me, the nuclear deterrent is fundamental to defence, so of course it should be in the defence budget. We're not going to take out GCAP, we're not going to take out frigates, and we're certainly not going to take out the nuclear deterrent, which is at the heart of the UK's defence. I'll give way to the Chair of the Select Committee in a minute.
I'm very grateful to the Minister. I like a lot of what he's saying, but just on that point, he's of course right that we have in Poland and Finland and in Sweden allies in NATO who produce great capability in terms of the threat from Russia. But we've also had, since 1989, China, now one of the two biggest economies in the world, spending £232 billion alone. That's just official numbers on defence. We have nuclear-armed North Korea. We have Iran making its way in the same direction. The world picture is darkening, and that may not necessarily, to refer to other honourable members, directly impact us, though I think it does, but it's certainly the indirect impact on some of our allies and where they need to place their resources. It's a real concern, and we shouldn't forget that.
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and it's why, in particular, I've repeatedly said on the need to reform defence procurement, it is because of the need to stay competitive with our adversaries. And indeed, I agree with the Honourable Lady, the Chair of the PAC, and also the comment from my Honourable Friend for Devizes, that we can't just look at what we want to spend, the future aspiration, we have to look at how we spend the money we have better, which is why on the 28th of February I announced our new integrated procurement model to completely overhaul our approach to acquisition. I said in my speech, and I stand by this, that the current delegated procurement model under the Levine reforms has created an inadvertent tendency towards over-programming, i.e. as soon as there is financial pressure on the equipment plan, such as we've had through inflation, the single services compete to get their capability on contract, whereas the very definition of our integrated approach is pan-defence prioritisation, as we are seeing in practice in our pending munitions plan, which will address many of the concerns from honourable and right honourable members about getting our industry up to spec in terms of missiles and other key munitions. And such prioritisation, just to be clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, would be challenging even if we went to 2.5%. Such is the nature of defence. But a particular priority for our new acquisition model, as referred to by the Chair of the Select Committee, is spiral development, accepting 60 or 80% of requirements rather than 100% exquisite. And I can confirm that the key to this, in terms of ramping up our engagement with industry, has seen us holding far more engagement with industry at a secret level. So just this very week, for example, we've held engagement at Strategic Command with industry about cyber and electronic warfare at secret, because we want to empower industrial innovation. I've also said that a key part of getting our industrial base as resilient as possible is export. So I'm delighted to confirm overnight news that BAE Systems will partner in Australia to build their nuclear-powered submarines. Yeah. This is a major moment for AUKUS, and the collective submarine building will support 7,000 additional British jobs across the programme's lifespan. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend for Hereford and South Herefordshire and the honourable lady who chaired the committee this week on AI both made the point about the importance of technology. He's absolutely right to stress that. One only has to look at the situation in Ukraine and the extraordinary propensity of electronic warfare, underlining how the battle space has changed. So a key part of our system is we have to be able to learn the lessons from the front line as rapidly as possible as we spiral our own developments in response. And I can confirm that we are learning those lessons. So, for example, as part of its drive to incorporate autonomous platforms flying alongside crewed fighters, the RAF is now progressing to procure drones to overwhelm an adversary's electronic warfare defences. This underlines an important point, Madam Deputy Speaker, that advantage in future warfare and uncrewed combat will not necessarily be gained by individual platforms or technologies. It will be their smart integration across crewed and uncrewed systems that will enable us to develop a force fit for the future, and is why I believe we do need an integrated approach to procurement. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, to conclude, the brief snapshot of military exercises I've outlined today does not do justice to the breadth and reach of our armed forces. They are more than ready. They are out there, deployed all over the world, keeping us safe and defending our interests. Meanwhile, the reforms we have made to procurement will help us adapt to emerging threats and evolving technological possibilities. That is a key lesson from Ukraine, and a key message from our Defence Command Paper. This government will continue to back our armed forces with record levels of defence spending, an ambitious 10-year equipment plan, and by forging a new partnership with industry to co-develop cutting-edge capabilities. It is a plan that will ensure our defence industrial base is more resilient and our armed forces better equipped. It is a comprehensive strategy for our national security, and I commend it to the House.
Sir Jeremy Quin to wind up.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Shadow Secretary of State referred, your predecessor in the chair at the start of this debate complimented those honourable members standing in this debate, saying he anticipated the debate rich in facts and high in quality. And almost universally, I think he proved absolutely right by what was an excellent debate. There's a universal view on both sides of this House, I believe, almost universal, that our brilliant armed forces are simply running too hard against all that is demanded of them to meet essential commitments. We have a war going on our continent. We've been referred to by the Defence Secretary that we are in a pre-war phase. Now, our select committees have an essential role to play in highlighting difficult issues. I believe we've been doing so this afternoon, and I'd like to endorse what the Chairman of the PAC said in relating to find more ways where select committees can scrutinise the most sensitive of defence programmes. That's important for Parliament, and it's helpful, I believe, for the Government. We have to rise to the significant challenges that have been set out in the two reports on readiness for the armed forces by ACDC and on the equipment plan by the PAC. I welcome what the Minister said about AUKUS. It's welcome news to hear that in this chamber. I didn't expect him to answer all the questions raised by those reports, but he must work on it, as I know the Department will work on it. We have our job to do. It is our duty to raise these difficult concerns, and I know both committees will continue to do so.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. The contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Thank you. We now come to the backbench debate on the reports of the